The smooth surface of the clear water rippled lightly. It shimmered with all the colors of the rainbow, golden in the sunlight, as if something was glowing from within. A stain of some kind loomed in the depths, rising to the surface. Natalie craned her neck, trying to see what it was on the other side of the water. There was something moving and fast approaching her. She could already make out the outline of something long and light, like a snake. The girl instinctively tried to recoil, but her body would not budge. It suddenly felt heavy. It seemed as if all her muscles were suddenly paralyzed. Panicky thoughts rushed through her head. An invisible hand of fear squeezed her throat, preventing her from breathing. Natalie drew in air convulsively and opened her eyes. For about 6 months now, almost every night she had had the same painful, frightening dream. Ever since that dark streak in her life, ever since the world had cracked and shattered. The carefree, joyful years of childhood and adolescence were marred by one tragic event. When Natalie was 13, her father died. He died in an industrial accident. A teenage girl for a long time could not come to terms with the death of her beloved father, who during his life in her soul did not want to. She even ran away from home for 2 days. She could not bear the depressing atmosphere of the funeral ceremony. She wanted him to remain alive and cheerful in her memory, as she saw him for the last time. Mum, a teacher of many years' experience, proved inflexible and tried to bring up her daughter in the same spirit. After they were left alone and on the fragile shoulders of a woman heavy burden of all the cares and problems, she began to tirelessly repeat to the girl simple truths. Natalie, you must get an education and acquire a profession. It's time to make up your mind. You must be independent. You have to be ready for anything. Life is unpredictable. You never know. But the daughter only waved away the boring moralizing. She did not see herself in the future, did not know what she wanted to become. She believed that fate itself will lead her to the right path. And now was the time of beauty, love, and happiness. The usual girlish care circled her in their colorful roundelay. Only sometimes the memories of her father came in waves. His warm, strong hands, his kind, loving gaze, friendly advice on any occasion. Now she was all grown up. Her adolescent maximalism had subsided, and Natalie would come to the cemetery to talk to the cold piece of marble. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she cried. "I'm sorry I was afraid I didn't see you off on your last journey. I miss you so much." Maybe that's why, when in her senior year of high school, she had an adult suitor almost 9 years older. She saw in him the intelligence, the life experience she had sorely lacked after Daddy's death. Michael, a successful young entrepreneur with good manners and the right outlook on life, seemed to her the ideal man. A real man's wife sits at home, keeps the family hearth, brings up the children, waits for her husband. He argued importantly out loud, and it seemed to the girl that this is how she would like to live her whole life. The effect that Michael's appearance near the school in a fancy car with a huge bouquet of roses had on her classmates only confirmed the correctness of her thoughts. The girls were gazing with admiring eyes at the prominent adult fiancé. They whispered and accompanied the lucky girl with envious glances. She married immediately after graduating from high school and plunged headlong into the life of a housewife. Natalie was proud of her husband, but she didn't get involved in his affairs. Michael was always busy, buying and selling all sorts of goods, from nail polish to cars. All day long and even on weekends he was at work. Endless calls, negotiations, shipments. But every evening he hurried home, where his faithful, caring wife was waiting for him. Natalie was also not bored when she stayed at home alone. All day long she cleaned, washed, ironed. She learned to cook the most incredible dishes. I found a special pleasure in these activities. I deduced my own axiom: if you take on everything in a good mood, and things will work out. Michael, however, often criticized the young housewife, insisting that everything should be the way his mother did it. Natalie took no offense. Let it be the way he was used to. She had no pity. The main thing was to preserve the balance and the atmosphere of peace in the house. The rest was just trifles. And she was enthusiastically organizing the family nest, dreaming of a friendly family with 2 children. Michael, however, insisted that there had to be at least 3, but Natalie knew she would be happy with any number. As many as God sent she would have. Wasn't that a happy life? What could possibly happen? Everything was going so well. The first pregnancy was an extraordinary joy. Michael was always looking for his wife, spoiling her, telling her how much he loved her. The mother-in-law was also happy and had already arranged for the birth in a private clinic. It seemed that the whole world revolved around Natalie, but the happiness did not last long. 2 months later, the pregnancy broke down. Natalie became depressed, unable to eat or drink. She wanted this baby so badly. Michael ineptly, as best he could, consoled his wife. "Everything we will still have. Do not cry, we are young. We'll have time to have more children." The next pregnancy again ended in miscarriage. Then, a thorough medical examination and long treatment, but all proved fruitless. Her mother-in-law almost never spoke to her when she met her, only unhappily pressed her lips and looked away. One day, by chance, Natalie overheard her saying to a neighbor, "You've got a defective daughter-in-law." The girl was hurt and offended to hear such a phrase. And between the spouses there was an unspoken taboo on the subject of children. Time passed. Natalie diligently cultivated in herself a huge sense of guilt, because it is her fault that a full-fledged family has not turned out. Michael became distant, no longer rushed home after work, as before, no longer hugged his wife on his return, even stopped smiling. Relationships in the family became strained. At the same time, in business went a series of failures, which entailed huge losses. Her husband's nerves were on edge, and Natalie tried not to bother him in vain with domestic issues. Another failed deal had put an end to his business. Michael reasoned aloud, pacing from corner to corner across the room in front of his startled wife. "I'm fed up. Suppliers are failing, customers are cheating, costs are rising. I'll sell the rest and close the company. I'm no good at being an entrepreneur. I'll work for hire. Nowadays, big companies are ready to pay good salaries to top managers. You work for someone, but you don't have any problems. You sleep well at night. Let the director worry about the company." Natalie tried to support and calm her spouse. "My love, every family has hard times. The two of us will get through it." "Will you shut up?" Her husband attacked her. "Don't get involved if you don't understand anything." Natalie stopped talking. She was silent most of the time now. Michael kept his word, and in 3 months he was employed by a large trading firm, headed by a woman, powerful and uncompromising, with an iron grip, worthy of the most skillful entrepreneur. At dinner, his husband often spoke of her with admiration. "Mrs. Vanessa, that woman is a true businesswoman. Achieves everything she needs. It's a pleasure to work with such a director. Business partners are afraid to even say a word in her direction." The boss had aggressive tactics not only in business, but also on the personal front. She kicked out her ex-husband a few years ago. What was the exact offense for which she had literally cut him out of her life? No one knew. It was known that she even managed to deprive him of parental rights to their common son. Mrs. Vanessa was immediately attracted to the young, energetic manager. She was not embarrassed neither by his marital status nor by his youth. He was 6 years younger than her. She is used to getting everything she wants, and Michael himself apparently was not against reciprocity. The affair began very quickly, and soon the young man received an ultimatum from the headmistress: either a bright, all-powerful Mrs. Vanessa or a quiet, inconspicuous wife. The choice was made instantly. On the day when Michael had announced with a sullen look that he intended to have a serious talk, Natalie knew instantly. She's not stupid. She saw everything, felt everything, but she sincerely hoped that her husband's secret infatuation was only temporary. Tears were traitorously coming to her eyes, and a nasty, prickly lump lodged somewhere in her throat, preventing her from saying a word. All that was left was to listen. "You see, it didn't work out. You can't even give me children," Michael gesticulated inspiringly, trying to convince either his wife or himself. What's a family without kids? Gaining more air in his lungs, he stood in front of her and said firmly, "Pack your things, I'll take you to your mother's. It's best for both of us." Natalie couldn't believe her own ears. Although she had assumed that the conversation would be about divorce, she had not expected to hear such cruel words from her husband. Everything around her, the world around her, suddenly ceased to exist. There was only an unhappy young woman all alone, depressed and thrown out of necessity on the sidelines of life. The mother was not even surprised to see her daughter with 2 suitcases in the hallway. She just sighed silently and shook her head, looking at the girl's condition. Natalie was in complete prostration, as if everything around her was not happening to her, lying where her mom had put her. Obediently, she swallowed her food and drank her tea without smelling or tasting it. She couldn't even cry. It was as if she had dried up inside, and there was only a shell left, a semblance of a person, a shadow, a ghost. It was only a week later that the woman woke up and realized what had happened. A wave of emotions came over her head with great delay. Everything was mixed: resentment, guilt, anger, confusion. But most of all, the most important question: how to live on. After all her adult life she was a housewife. After school, it is always easier to go to study. Knowledge is still fresh in the memory. And now, especially in such a state, what can you count on? You can forget about university. That's when you realize that mom was right. You can't grieve for a long time about the ruined family life and sit at your mother's side. I couldn't sit on her neck, and I didn't want to. She had to summon up all her willpower to get back on her feet. Natalie got a job as a waitress in a respectable restaurant, which promised a good salary. At the same time, she decided to look for some courses. After all, not all her life to run with a tray. Although fate even here caught up with the unfortunate woman, very fond of the boss of her ex-husband, and now his mistress, this restaurant. Or maybe she just enjoyed showing off in front of her defeated rival, raising her self-esteem. Mrs. Vanessa booked a table in advance, which was served by Natalie, and studied the menu for a long time without letting the waitress go. It seemed like torture or even execution. The ex-wife had to stand just one step away from the man who had betrayed her, and at the same time smiling favorably at valued customers. Michael, at first, was also confused by these circumstances. But soon the man got used to it, and even left his ex-wife generous tips with a patronizing look. Natalie was unpleasant, but she silently tolerated it, clenched her teeth and stretched her lips in an artificial smile, which the management demanded of her. And the bosses were finicky. The administrator always followed her around and picked on every little thing. And all because of the fact that once she dared to stand up for her colleague, thin, unattractive waitress Terry. When the boss began to scold her in every possible way, Natalie couldn't stand it and demanded respectful treatment of her subordinates. Terry, however, did not say thank you, but was indignant. Why do you bother? Let them call you names. But then he will definitely send to serve rich clients, to earn money. And now he won't be angry with us, and he won't let you live. Today the restaurant was not crowded. Her ex-husband and his new girlfriend were not there. Thank God. They said the boss had taken her new favorite to some exotic island. Natalie only had 2 tables occupied. In a quiet, secluded corner behind some artificial palm trees, there was a young couple holding hands and whispering incessantly about something of their own. At the window sat a man of about 40 in a solid suit next to his son, who looked no more than 6. For some reason, the boy was always whimpering and whining, and the disgruntled father was constantly pulling him down, and in the literal sense of the word, forcefully pulled his arm and angrily hissed something in his face. "Shut up. Shut up already," came the waitress's voice. Natalie didn't like this educational moment. The boy seemed to be hurt and offended by it, and he just couldn't hold back the tears as he continued to cry endlessly. My heart filled with pity for this completely miserable-looking child. When the waitress brought his order, she smiled and winked cheerfully, trying to calm and cheer him up. He looked at the stranger strangely and fell silent. He studied the young woman carefully, even from afar, after she had withdrawn. He escorted her with a long, penetrating stare. Noticing that the man had gone to the bathroom, Natalie hurried to the table, where the sad boy remained alone. "Hi. Why are you always crying?" She leaned over to him, smiling genuinely. "And what's your name?" The little boy again began to study the waitress with his huge and lively eyes. His gaze even gave her goosebumps. "My name is James." "Natalie," he replied in a surprisingly even and calm tone, perfectly mature intonation. The woman arched her eyebrows in surprise, but quickly realized her name was written on the name tag. What a good boy. He read well, she praised the little one, and extended her hand to him in a friendly manner. "Well then, let's get acquainted." James put his baby hand into her palm and squeezed it tightly. How much strength did he have? Suddenly, their handshake sent a jolt of electricity running through the young woman's body. She even shrieked involuntarily and pulled her hand out in fright. "Oh," she exclaimed embarrassedly to justify her awkward gesture, "are you electrocuting yourself?" And she laughed. But the boy didn't even smile, and with a stony face explained, "I'm the one who scanned you." "What?" the waitress interjected. "How's that?" "Well, studied your biofield," he replied. The interlocutor was confused. The woman was completely confused and froze in bewilderment, opening her eyes wide. "Don't be surprised. I got my powers from my mum. She was a fortune teller. At the memory of his mother, the boy's eyes clouded with sadness and filled with tears. "Where's your mum?" Natalie asked cautiously. "She died," James sighed sadly, "quite a while ago." "And that's your dad with you, I guess." "No," the boy replied sharply and frowned. "That's Uncle Justin, Mum's headmaster. He made her work hard, and you can't guess often. That's why she got really sick." James fell silent. His lips trembled. Natalie put her hand on his shoulder sympathetically, but she didn't know how she could help him. Meanwhile, the boy continued. "Uncle Justin took me to his place and wants me to tell people fortunes too. But I don't want to. I don't like it. And it gives me a headache." He looked at the skeptical waitress and read the disbelief in her eyes. Apparently to prove his point, the boy stated, "You, Natalie, have only been working here for a short time. Before that you stayed at home, and then you divorced your husband because he had another aunt." Natalie stared at him dumbfounded, wide-eyed and paralyzed, unable to utter a word. Was it really true? She had never believed in mysticism or predictions, and this is so accurate. How could she not believe it? "Where do you live, James? How can I find you?" she asked with difficulty, coming to her senses. "What's the matter?" A menacing voice behind her made her startled and look round. Uncle Justin's barbed, unpleasant gaze was drilling her from under his bushy eyebrows. Natalie felt uneasy and hurriedly excused herself. The boy was crying a lot. I wanted to comfort him. The man immediately tossed the boy coldly and peremptorily. "James, pack up. Let's go home." The waitress never had time to say anything else. She just stared at them through the window pane until they got into the taxi, mentally chastising herself for her cowardice and indecision. Anthony, the lanky, red-haired driver, had worked in taxis for several years and often drove customers from an expensive restaurant in the city center. When he noticed the new attractive waitress, he even went inside for a cup of coffee, which cost him a whole order, but gave him a chance to chat with the object of his affection. Natalie had realized for a long time that the taxi driver was attracted to her, but she persisted in pretending not to notice the signs of his attention. She didn't like Anthony. He had an unpleasant bald spot on his head, a sticky look, a smile and jokes that were not funny. But today she had to talk to him herself. Important information was needed. "Anthony, can you please tell me what address you took the man and the boy to?" "About an hour ago." The man looked surprised, but obediently answered, "Brick Street, and the house, wait a minute, I think it's 16. "Yes, that's right." 16. What's the matter? Did they forget something?" The young woman still couldn't calm down after her conversation with that boy. She wanted to share this strange story with someone. "Natalie, why would you do that?" Anthony grimaced after listening to the woman. "These fortune tellers, fortune telling, it's all nonsense. Let them sort it out for themselves. Otherwise you'll get into trouble. Do you even know what kind of house is behind that big fence? The bloke's obviously got money and power. And there's a child suffering behind that fence." She was indignant. "How can I rest easy knowing that?" Seeing that his sympathy was determined, Anthony stopped half speaking and nodded his head. "All right, if you need any help, you can count on me." Now his appearance didn't seem so repulsive anymore. A normal man, she thought. First impressions were deceiving. Natalie couldn't move her arms or legs. Her eyes widened with terror as she watched something approaching the surface of the water in front of her face. Fear gripped her completely, crushed her chest and throat. A little more, and she would begin to choke. Finally, it surfaced from the depths. Only now did Natalie see that it was not a snake at all. It was a human hand. No, it was a small child's hand, reaching out to her with a pleading hand, gulping for air. Natalie jerked and woke up. She struggled to catch her breath, wiped her sweat-wet forehead, and remembered what she had seen in the dream. Only now did she realize it was James' small hand. He's asking for help. It's a sign. She simply must rescue him from the clutches of the cruel tyrant who had already killed his mother. Anthony didn't fail. He drove her to Brick Street, as arranged. He parked, however, far away, pointing to the right house with his hand, and remained waiting in the car. The three-story mansion rose majestically and menacingly behind a threateningly high fence. Peering into its room, then into the windows from inside, Natalie tried to find James with her eyes. But the house remained completely lifeless. Maybe there's just no one there, the thought flashed through her mind. But after ringing almost immediately, a disgruntled male voice muttered from the intercom. Speaking. "Excuse me, I'm a waitress from the restaurant where you had lunch yesterday. And what do you want?" The man rudely interrupted her. "I didn't leave a tip and you're here to collect it." Ignoring the rudeness, Natalie continued. "I'd like to speak to you, please. It's very important." The intercom went silent. Just a minute later, the gate opened with a loud metallic click, and Uncle Justin appeared wearing a tracksuit over a not-at-all athletic body. With a mute question on his face, he stared at the uninvited guest. "I'm sorry, Justin," the woman began timidly. "I had a little talk with James yesterday and realized he's not doing well at your place." "Did he tell you that?" The man interrupted her sharply. "Yes, he told me he has a special gift, and you want him to follow in his mother's footsteps." "What possesses what?" he interjected, with a look of utter bewilderment on his face. "Listen, girl," he said, adopting an elevated tone. "We're all right. You've got something on your mind there. What gift?" He twirled his finger at his temple. "Are you out of your mind? You need to leave nicely. Otherwise, I'll have to call the police," he said, slamming the gate in her face, giving her no further opportunity to say anything. Natalie exhaled shakily. She realized that trying to talk to Justin again was futile. But what did she want that he would immediately repent and change? No, she needed to approach the issue of saving the boy in a different way. "How is it, poor child?" She complained to Anthony on the way back. "He's all alone in the whole world, and there's absolutely no one to stand up for him." "Life is complicated," replied the cabbie, "but he lives in a fancy house and eats in restaurants. So it's not so bad." Again, Anthony was showing his Philistine gut. It made Natalie uncomfortable, and she fell silent, staring blankly ahead at the road, wondering what more could be done for the poor orphan. "Mom, do we know anyone at the child welfare authorities?" Natalie asked from the doorstep before she could even take off her shoes. She looked at her daughter in surprise. "So Marion works there. Have you forgotten? It's been there for probably 10 years, if not more." "That's right. How did I not remember before?" The woman rejoiced. She happily pecked her mother on the cheek and pulled her phone out of her pocket to make an appointment. Marion was unspeakably happy to see her own niece. "Natalie, you look so much prettier. How's the divorce treating you? Did it do you any good?" she concluded unexpectedly. "You say so too," she grinned bitterly. She remembered that her aunt had always disliked Michael. "Really, really," laughed the woman. "Listen to me. Life is long and unpredictable. Things can still change so abruptly. Believe me, I've seen a lot of things in my lifetime." Natalie knew about the hard fate of her mom's sister, who at the age of 20 was left a widow with a 1-year-old baby in her arms. Her second husband was kicked out for drunkenness. But now in her third marriage, they say, finally found happiness and peace of mind. Yes, it was Aunt Marion who would understand her and try to help her. The woman listened carefully to her niece's confused story and quickly ran her fingers over the keyboard of her computer, looking carefully at the monitor. "So let's make a deal right away. I haven't heard anything from you about this child. There's just a boy who's being abused," she warned her in a businesslike manner. "Right?" Aunt Marion piped up. "There is such a guardian, Justin." She delved deeper into studying the text on the screen. Well. But he didn't adopt the child. That's very good for us," she summarized. "I want to take James for myself," Natalie suddenly blurted out. The woman looked at her niece in surprise. "Have you thought, well, Natalie, this is after all a child with its own fate and tragedy. It won't be easy." "Yes, well, I have thought it over," she chided firmly and flashed her eyes resolutely. "I want custody of this boy. I think he really needs me, and I think I need him too." Aunt Marion looked at her niece carefully from under her spectacles and said, "Well, all right. I'm not omnipotent, of course, but I'll help in any way I can. Here, take the list of documents and slowly collect them." "And what will we do about the financial situation?" She suddenly remembered. A mere waitress is unlikely to be given a child. "I'll think of something." "Aunt Marion," Natalie begged in a pleading voice. "Well, think, my good one," the woman said. "You still have time, too." After a cloudy and rainy week, it was finally a sunny, warm day. Natalie was in high spirits as she hurried to the orphanage. Today she would finally see James for the first time since he had been taken from Justin, and for only the second time in her life. The slight excitement hadn't left her since this morning. She didn't know how he would react to her, how he would look at her, what he would say. What if he didn't want her at all? The pupils were out in the courtyard. The woman searched the grounds for James with her gaze. A thin, pale boy with huge, touching eyes sat away from the noisy children, as if waiting for something. When he saw Natalie from a distance, he broke away and ran towards her. For the first time, she saw the happy smile on his face. "I knew you'd come for me," he said. And the woman's heart snapped. "I'm just visiting for now," Natalie replied, and crouched down beside him to ask the main question that had been plaguing her for a long time. "Would you like to live with me?" "Of course," he exclaimed without hesitation. "Would you?" he asked suddenly. Natalie looked at James affectionately. "I shall be only too glad. I can't have children after all," she replied, and tears glistened in her eyes. It was too painful a subject. The boy looked into her face and said in a serious tone, "Natalie, you will have more children, but only when you meet your man." "Thank you, James." "That's not what the doctors say," she smiled sadly. "And I can see that they will," the boy stubbornly persisted. The young woman pulled him to her and hugged him gently. "You are my good, you are my happiness." A hand, or rather a child's hand. "James, we have to save him, get him out of the water." "Natalie." Everyone strained to find the strength to break the stupor and reach for the poor baby. She couldn't breathe at all, but she struggled to reach for the little hand until she clung to it. And then the realization came. Everything was turned upside down. The light was falling and reflecting on the other side of the water. Natalie suddenly realized that it was not the boy who was in the water. It was she who was drowning, but still struggling in the dark abyss. That's why her movements were so stiff. That's why she couldn't breathe. As soon as she realized this, the child's hand pulled her easily towards herself. The woman jerked out of the water and breathed in the healing, intoxicating air, the release. Natalie opened her eyes. It was already dawn. The first timid rays of sunlight were shining through the curtains. The woman lay there and just breathed evenly and serenely. An extraordinary state of peace enveloped her gently and carefully. There was peace of mind. She knew that this painful dream was her last. A familiar figure with a cigarette in his hand was already looming at the entrance to the restaurant. Anthony was waiting for Natalie. "Greetings." Anthony brightened happily, and his freckled face lit up at the sight of his familiar. "Hi," she replied simply as she walked, not wanting to stop and listen to another stupid thing. "How are things going with James?" he tossed after her, trying to latch on to one last opportunity. After that question, Natalie couldn't help but stop. After all, the man had helped her once completely unselfishly. A few thoughtless phrases thrown his way didn't mean he was indifferent to the plight of a poor orphan. You can't be so prejudiced against this man. Natalie recounted her visit to the Board of Guardianship and complained about the only problem separating her from custody of James. Anthony suddenly spat out a perfectly adequate idea. You could enter into a sham marriage and the family income would become perfectly acceptable to take custody. Natalie looked at the young man with surprise. Maybe she had underestimated him, but she shrugged her shoulders immediately. Who would I be able to make such a marriage with? Who would go for such a thing? Me, for instance, Anthony answered timidly, and looked at her with a look of admiration and lust at the same time. Natalie even looked embarrassed and blushed, then shook her head negatively. You don't get it. The man interrupted, suddenly realizing that he had startled the woman with his revelation. I'm offering to help you as a friend. You won't owe me anything. Really? Why would you want to do that? The woman was perplexed. I like you, he answered honestly, and I can see that this is very important to you. I just want to help. From the bottom of my heart. But how are we all going to fit in Mum's 2-bedroom flat? Natalie waved her hands in confusion. Why cramp, Mum? He exclaimed. I've got a 3-bedroom that's empty. I got it from my grandmother. It's just enough room for everyone, and the Board of Guardians won't have a problem with it. What are you saying, Anthony? We'll cramp you. It's uncomfortable. She was still hesitant. The man took the woman's palm in his hand, gave it a gentle squeeze, and let the last argument play out. Please, I'm going to go crazy from loneliness soon. I'd be happy to have someone in my house at last. Natalie thought for a moment and then said, Then let's make a deal right away. I'll pay the utilities. Whatever you say, the man replied and threw his hands up in the air, signaling that he agreed to any of her terms. But James had an ambivalent reaction to the noble taxi driver, just as he had with Natalie. He began the acquaintance by scanning her. Anthony cried out in pain and even collapsed to his knees. It was noticeable that the boy didn't like him. Is something wrong? Natalie asked in a whisper as the man stepped back. James made a grimace. Not knowing how to properly express his feelings, he confessed nonetheless. Natalie, you and him are different. He's just a friend, she hastened to explain. But the boy shook his head sadly and summarized. No, he doesn't know how to be a friend. These words puzzled the woman. What did he mean by that? That Anthony was a bad person, but it sounded completely different. In the end, it was too late to retreat. Anthony's 2-room flat was a bachelor pad on the outskirts of the city in the fullest sense of the word. Natalie had to spend 2 days scrubbing it so she could live there without fear of sticking to a grease stain in the kitchen or breathing in years of dust on the furniture and fixtures. A few potted flowers, a couple of pictures on the walls and curtains on the windows helped make the space cozy. This was something the woman knew a lot about after a long career as a housewife. Of course, for Natalie and James, it's a temporary home. But they wanted to live like human beings and somehow thank their landlord for his generosity. When Natalie arrived for her shift at the door of the restaurant, she was unexpectedly confronted by James's former guardian. Justin pretended not to recognize her and strode past in a dignified manner. Terry was cleaning a table by the window, and Natalie headed straight for her. Hi, did you serve that man? She asked, pointing out the window. The skinny girl shook her head negatively. No, he didn't have lunch. Went straight to the receptionist's office, and they had a long talk there. Why do you ask? She looked at Natalie curiously. No, nothing, she replied absent-mindedly in deep thought. Her intuition had not failed her. Almost in the middle of the day, the receptionist gathered the entire staff, including the kitchen. His concerned expression did not bode well. We have an emergency in the establishment, he announced loudly. One of our guests is missing a purse. After these words, everyone looked at each other in surprise, and the man continued. This is a regular customer of ours. He promised not to make a fuss if the thief is found and punished to the fullest extent. He looked round the audience with a scrutinizing gaze and made an ominous statement. And the thief, by the way, is in this room right now. The staff murmured. Someone asked a perfectly logical question. How are we going to figure him out? Very simple. explained the receptionist. Now everyone will take everything out of their pockets and bags and put it on the table in front of them. Everyone began obediently raking out and laying out cigarettes, lighters, wallets with keys, crumpled notes and tipped coins, combs and cosmetics. When Natalie peered into the bottom of her purse, she was stunned and froze in place, unable to move in amazement. "What do you have in there?" The supervisor jumped up to her in a flash. She silently took out a black purse and said in a trembling voice, "It's not mine, I'm not a thief." She realized what the whole show was about. She knew she couldn't prove anything. A dozen eyes looked at her with silent judgment. The receptionist couldn't resist a snide remark. "Well, of course, the wallet must have jumped into your purse by itself." "That's it, dearie," he summarized. "Your reputation has been destroyed and cannot be restored. You are dismissed." Said. Bitterness of resentment and a keen sense of injustice stung her chest painfully. But what could she object to the words of her superior, when he had already decided everything and had predetermined the culprit and the punishment for him? Apparently Justin, who had the most to gain from Natalie's dismissal, had additionally incentivized the administrator this afternoon. It was probably all because of James. No, she wouldn't give up that easily. Natalie didn't put in her notice and tried to get a job at another restaurant, but the next few establishments, after reviewing her paperwork, all answered the same thing. On the face of it, alas, the woman is certainly decent and responsible, but unfortunately is on the blacklist. "In this field, in our city, you are closed forever," they told her. It was urgent to find a job, at least temporarily. Natalie realized that Justin was watching her struggles, looking for an excuse and waiting for an opportunity to take James away from her, so she was ready to jump at any opportunity. A notice on the door of one of the offices had come to her attention. There was an urgent need for a cleaner. So be it, she thought. The firm was young and small. The hiring was handled by the director himself. Nicholas looked to be just over 30. Apparently, in most questions he relied on his own intuition, because in the documents of the applicant looked only a glimpse. But he looked carefully, with genuine interest in her face. His lively gray eyes radiated good-heartedness and aroused trust. "What made such a pretty girl accept the position of cleaner?" he asked with a smile. Natalie suddenly erupted in surprise. She hadn't expected this from herself. The hurt from the unfair dismissal was still fresh, and her emotions were running high. She told everything she could about her ex-husband, James, her efficient marriage, and the vindictive administrator. She'd given it all away. Nicholas listened without interrupting her. Natalie thought he sighed a couple of times. When the woman finished, she exhaled and looked down at him. She was still trembling, fearing judgment, waiting for criticism, and, naturally, rejection. What a fool she was to dump everything on a complete stranger, and even the director of the company. Who would hire her with such a load of problems? But the man only smiled and said briefly, "Tomorrow from 9 o'clock I'll wait for you at work." She flew home, or rather to her flat, as if on wings. There are good people in the world. "James," she praised her son, "my boy, I found a job in the office." "I told you you'd find one," he replied, businesslike. Natalie laughed merrily and hugged the little fortune teller. How lucky she was to have him now. She would do anything to have him with her. The new boss turned out to be not only responsive, but also kind-hearted and generous. He let the new mum off early and often gave James sweets. One day Nicholas gave Natalie a ride home and kissed her hand goodbye. It took her breath away, and all the way up to the floor, she made a Herculean effort to push away the memory of the sweet kiss. No, one cannot fall in love with this amazing man. One must realize who she is and who he is. Why does he even need her? A marriageable, as her former mother-in-law used to say. No, it's her job to raise James. She should forget about herself forever, she thought. Anthony met her at the door with a strained expression. "Who's that?" he asked the woman sharply right at the threshold. "What do you mean?" she wondered, though she already guessed what he was getting at. "Who gave you a lift?" the man interjected. He was visibly nervous. "The director of the firm. I got a lift on the way. What's the matter?" "On the road right to the driveway?" Anthony asked wryly. "Just what I need is jealousy. Natalie's mind flashed. And out loud, she asked in a calm tone, "Should James and I leave?" That direct question immediately cooled the jealous man's ardor. "Oh, come on, Natalie. I was just asking." The woman hoped that the incident was over, but in vain. Something depressed Anthony. Something was brewing within him. He became silent and sullen. He allowed himself a bottle, and then dared to shyly put his arm round his spectacular wife's waist when she was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She would immediately turn round and give him a reproachful look, which would calm him down for a while. Natalie didn't like this whole situation. Something had to be done. But she didn't want to offend Anthony, and how to move out without hurting the feelings of a man in love she had not yet thought of. The only escape for the woman was to spend time with James. Before going to bed, he would climb into bed with her and ask her to read stories. He listened to stories of Prince Dwarf and talking animals until late in the evening. The boy cuddled trustingly to Natalie, and it made her heart swoon. Now she couldn't get enough of him. The young woman gently took his little hands in her hands and admired them. The very hands that had saved her from the abyss of misfortune and given her the meaning of life. The boss had been watching the cleaning lady rubbing the same spot on the glass door for about 10 minutes, completely absorbed in her own thoughts and not noticing anything around her. "Natalie, are you going to wipe the hole now?" Replacing the door wasn't part of my plans, he tried to joke. The woman woke up from her forgetfulness, looked round and laughed. "Sorry, Nicholas, I was just thinking." "Is something wrong with you?" he inquired. No reason, she tried to evade answering. "A quarrel with your husband," the supervisor surmised. Natalie sighed heavily. There was no hiding anything from this shrewd man. "He's not my husband," she exclaimed heartily. "I told you, it's a sham marriage. A good acquaintance is helping me as a friend." "Then I have a chance," Nicholas said with a wink. And they both laughed. "I wouldn't mind," Natalie's mind flashed. In an instant, all the clouds over her head cleared and all her problems were forgotten. It felt light and bright. On the way home, the principal's tinted car caught up with Natalie at the bus stop. Nicholas jumped out and opened the passenger door obligingly. "Let me give you a lift." My legs were buzzing after a day's work. There was no desire to refuse. On the contrary, I wanted to talk longer with a man with a great sense of humor and a high level of intelligence, from whom I could smell a subtle, elusive aroma of pleasant male perfume. He didn't reek of liquor from the local liquor store 3 meters away. "Thank you," the woman smiled happily and sat down in the offered seat. "I'll be right back," the boss suddenly said and disappeared somewhere. A minute later, he plumped into the driver's seat and handed Natalie a nice little bouquet. "I told you I'd be courting," he smiled embarrassedly. The woman didn't say anything back. She buried her nose in the flowers, inhaling their wonderful scent. She even covered her eyes in pleasure. No, she had certainly been given flowers before. Her ex-husband strictly on schedule twice a year, on her birthday and on the 8th of March. But to get flowers just like that without a reason. It was an amazing, completely unfamiliar or simply long-forgotten feeling. This tiny, unpretentious bouquet, given from the bottom of her heart, reminded her that she was a woman. Yes, just a woman, young and beautiful, worthy of simple female happiness. As she walked up the stairs holding the flowers to her chest, Natalie smiled at herself and at the feelings that were emerging in her. She felt like a fairy tale sleeping princess awakened by a beautiful prince. After a long sleep, the desire to love and be loved finally awoke in her. The woman woke up from her pleasant thoughts only when a distinct odor of alcoholic beverage hit her nose. Anthony stood in the doorway. The flushed face and the unhealthy glint in his eyes spoke volumes. "Yep, flowers already, so here we go, you creep," he remarked in a strange tone of voice. "You're all right, aren't you?" Better not to mess with a drunk, Natalie thought, and tried to slip past the man inside the flat. But the man grabbed her arm with his huge claw, demanding an immediate answer. "What are you saying? Are things getting better or not? Answer me quickly." "It hurts me." "Let go. What are you doing?" Natalie tried to pull free. But her resistance only irritated the drunk taxi driver. He scooped her up and pulled her against him. "What, you don't want to be with me?" "Disgust you?" He gloated as he watched the woman try in vain to twist out of his rough embrace. "I realize only bosses are good for love, and simple laborers like Anthony are only for friendship and help." He was winding himself up as he spoke, and Natalie was horrified to see the bloodshot look in his eyes. He was out of control and could do something stupid or worse. "I love you. I love you for real," he shouted in her face, fumes of liquor wafting from his mouth. The woman pushed the man with all her might. He staggered back and loosened his grip for a moment. That was enough. Natalie broke free and ran down the stairs. She was shaking all over. She even had to sit down in the public garden to calm down and get her thoughts in order. Thank goodness James is still at detention. Now I'll pick him up and never, ever come back here again, she thought. Anthony sat sullenly behind the wheel of a parked car waiting for an order. His mood was not good. After Natalie's escape, he'd gone on a bender for a week, until his boss called and threatened to sack him for absenteeism. His head was cracking and unpleasant thoughts were swarming in his head. And why are women so stupid? What was I lacking? And the flat is, and hands from the right place grows, and earn if you want Anthony can better than some directors of firms. But no, this princess turns her nose up at him. He's for her. "Why are women so stupid?" came from his right. Anthony looked in surprise at the stout man peering through the open window into the saloon. The strange man seemed to be reading his mind. "What?" the taxi driver perplexedly interrogated. The man opened the door and sat down in the passenger seat. Only now did Anthony recognize him. It was the same Justin he'd once given a lift with James. "Divorce, I say," the unexpected passenger continued. "Divorcing," the man replied glumly. Women," the man began to rant. "They should take advantage of them and dump them afterwards." Anthony only remained silent, staring at the dashboard. The fat man surprisingly got into his mood with his speeches. "Would you like her to come back to you on her own?" Justin asked suddenly, and looked at the taxi driver carefully. "The important thing in this matter is to find the pain point," he said instructively. "Listen to what needs to be done." Natalie didn't want to go back to Anthony's flat even to get her own things. So it was necessary to splurge on basic shopping. Unplanned spending came up and had to go to work to ask for an advance. James had to be taken along too. There was no one to leave him with. "I'm sorry, Nicholas," she began confusingly. "I know payday isn't until the day after tomorrow, but I really need the money. Can I ask for at least some of it today?" The supervisor smiled good-naturedly and nodded his head. "Sure, maybe you need more." No, she refused at once. The principal took notice of her condition. Excitement was readable on her face. "Natalie, what's your problem?" There was no point in hiding the trouble. "I'm getting a divorce," she sighed. "The trial is in a week. I'm worried it won't affect the custody." "It'll be fine," he reassured her. To Natalie, his kind smile was a comfort to her wounded heart. Somehow this man wanted to be believed. The warden looked at the boy affably. "So you're James? Hello?" The man fearlessly stepped closer and confidently took the man's hand. Natalie rushed towards them, but it was too late. Nicholas instinctively jerked his hand away from the source of the electric shock. "That hurts," he said, rubbing his arm, and laughed. And James suddenly said in an unexpectedly serious tone, "You can rest assured, that offer you got in the mail at 0900 today will make you a lot of money. Take it." The man even opened his mouth in surprise. "How do you know?" Natalie hastened to explain. "Excuse me, please. James has some powers of foresight. I don't know how it works, but he almost always turns out to be right." Nicholas squatted down beside the boy to keep up with him and asked, "What exactly do you see on this proposal? Can you elaborate?" The man shrugged uncertainly. "Not much. It's like it's glowing and warming with its rays. And I know it's very important for you, for your life." The dazed man turned to Natalie. "Amazing. I actually received a tempting deal offer today, but I can't make up my mind. After all, it involves a whole new direction. And that's a big risk." "Don't be afraid," the boy repeated with confidence in his voice. "It will be all right. I can see that clearly." Nicholas looked the boy carefully in the eye and replied seriously, "I'll think about it. Thank you, James." A short, balding man wearing glasses entered the courtroom and took a seat beside Natalie. "Hello, I'm your lawyer, Mr. William," he introduced himself. "But I didn't hire a lawyer," she wondered. "There must be some mistake. I don't even have any money for your services." "Don't worry about that," he replied businesslike, placing papers from a brown leather briefcase on the table. "Nicholas has already taken care of everything. By the way, you get his regards," the lawyer smiled. Natalie mentally thanked the principal, but the excitement still went nowhere. The proceedings were going standard, but when Anthony took the floor, the woman's heart clenched unpleasantly in anticipation of something bad, and she was not mistaken. Once in the past, a noble man and a true friend began to tell various tall tales, and to describe everything in colorful detail about what immoral lifestyle she leads, how she leaves little James alone at home for 24 hours, that she and the child will have nowhere to live after the divorce. He concluded by stating loud and clear that she simply had to be stripped of custody, or she would ruin the child. The woman was rendered speechless by the flood of lies poured on her by the man who had recently spoken of his love. It was vile and disgusting. Why? Why had he done this to her? What was he hoping for? Did he just want to hurt her? Or did he think she'd get scared and come back to him? She had no answer to those questions. She had no energy left for anything at all. Luckily, a lawyer took the stand instead. He approached the judge with a pile of some documents and began laying them out in front of him one by one. "Here, Your Honor. This is the testimony of the neighbors about the plaintiff's moral character. All the character references are positive. Here is their testimony about the defendant. Often drinks, swears, scandalizes. And here's a gift from Nicholas to Natalie for a flat of 75 square meters." Natalie even stood up and opened her mouth in amusement. "A gift deed of gift for a flat," she interjected. It was a surprise for the plaintiff. The lawyer calmly explained to the judge, on whose face you could already see what decision he was going to make. "Nicholas," Natalie indignantly piped up, "I can't accept such an expensive gift. Thank you, of course. And for the lawyer, too. But a flat is just too much." "Oh, really, Natalie?" replied the supervisor calmly. "It's just a small thank you to you and James for helping me with the business. I did get this deal done after all, and made a multi-million-dollar profit. So I'm just returning the favor. It's not even up for discussion," he insisted. "I don't even know." The woman was confused. And Nicholas inquired, "So, how did it go?" "Thank you. It's all good." "Thanks to you," the woman replied with gratitude in her voice. "Now I'm free again." "Well then, Natalie," Nicholas said solemnly, "I'm inviting you to dinner tonight with James." The woman's heart beat joyfully. To how right Aunt Marion was? Half an hour ago, she had been the most miserable person in the world after yet another betrayal. She was sure she had lost the most precious thing in her life. And now she was already immensely happy. How quickly things change. The main thing is not to lose hope and believe in a bright future. Natalie sat down on a bench in the shade of a lime tree and took a book out of her bag. But she couldn't read. Her gaze was fixed on the playground, where James was frolicking with the other children, watching the boy with the big, sad eyes. Over the past year, he had turned into a normal child. Natalie and Nicholas had agreed at once never to think about their son's gift, and he seemed to have forgotten about it too. Now he lived a normal and carefree life as a child. He played, studied, played sports. New acquaintances shook his hand boldly. James didn't scare anyone anymore. In the pram from the window came a quiet sniffle, the fruit of Natalie and Nicholas' love. The young mummy leaned over her and rocked her gently. The baby fell back into a peaceful, restful sleep. Natalie opened her economics textbook and found the paragraph she needed. The session was coming up, and she had to get ready. She did go to university, but she did it for herself. Not for her husband, who worked in this field, not for her mother, who had insisted on getting a profession for many years. No, she did it for herself because she is interested in it, because she wants to grow and develop. And whether it will be useful to her or not, it will be seen later, because she controls her own destiny. The main thing is that she has a family, a beloved man, and 2 children. Everything is just as she dreamed. The rich man looked out of the window and saw the little boy take a crust of bread out of the bin. And after barely following him, T4. Nicholas parked outside a shopping center and looked out the window. It was an early August evening. The day was already slipping towards dusk, but it gets dark late in the summer. It was still a long way from the cool, fresh twilight. Nicholas had had a difficult day at work checking the month's results, developing a new project. But the man even liked this multitasking. Firstly, the solution of constantly arising issues seemed to be a fascinating game. Secondly, at the end of the month will be a good raise to the already high salary. Thirdly, work issues distracted from sad thoughts, did not let me dive into the past. Fatigue, workload that was an escape from heavy feelings. Nicholas did not hurry to get out of the car. It was cool in the cabin, and there, outside scorching. It had been an abnormal heat wave for several weeks now. People were looking forward to autumn, to breathe freely. Nicholas looked out the window again. 2 people came into his field of vision, a middle-aged man and a skinny teenage boy, tall, a little angular. He was walking and talking animatedly with his father, gesticulating vigorously, smiling from time to time. Light, springy gait, tanned long arms, legs, feet, brightly colored sneakers. When Nicholas saw boys like that, he always wondered if he might have a son just like him right now. He would have turned 14 this summer, would have received a passport. Perhaps his son would be into programming or sports football, basketball, or maybe he liked to draw. But what's the use of thinking about it if this boy was never born? Or maybe it wasn't supposed to be a boy at all, a girl. But a sixth sense told Nicholas that many years ago he had lost a son through his own fault. To think otherwise was to try to justify and deceive himself. How many times over the years had Nicholas regretted his behavior? But there was no turning back the clock. All he had to do was suffer with guilt, long for an unfulfilled future, miss Bridget, and vainly try to look for her traits in others. To look, and of course not to find her. Nicholas had been different, then young, selfish, even windy. Before he met Bridget, he'd never wanted to remember his old self. It was embarrassing. How could he have behaved like that? Nicholas realized that thoughts and memories were taking over him again. It happened sometimes, some situations from the past, voices, images, all of it still wouldn't let him go. And the man assumed it wouldn't let go. Well, he deserved a life like this. Nicholas was born and raised in a fairly well-to-do family for his city. Father a successful businessman, mother chief accountant of a large factory. Big beautiful house, expensive toys, fashionable clothes, traveling. Nicholas did not know anything to refuse. In addition to parents, he was actively spoiled grandparents on both sides. The boy early realized that between them there is a kind of competition who the grandson loves more. And the cunning kid began to take advantage of this, played on the feelings of elderly relatives, manipulated them, and achieved everything he wanted. Nicholas studied at a prestigious public school. There he always had a lot of friends, boys and girls. They formed a strong and very cheerful company. All these were children from wealthy families, so teenagers did not deny themselves anything: cafes, amusement rides, entertainment centers. Later, expensive clubs, partying in bars. Nicholas's life was fun and carefree. He entered the local university, did not want to go to New York, as his father did not persuade him. Harvard, it's a completely different level. Other prospects, the parent insinuated the grown-up offspring. But this same offspring understood perfectly well that there he would not have the same freedom as here. At Harvard, he would have to work hard on his books, otherwise he would not get a diploma. And here he has everything already in place. On a tip from his older friends, Nicholas knew who and how much to pay before the session, so as not to waste his youth on lectures and seminars. And the kid was not going to deviate from his plans. As always, everything turned out exactly as he wanted. Nicholas became a student of the economics department of the local university, and a golden era of life came for him. From his parents, the guy moved out. Grandmother and grandfather on his father's side gave the only grandson in honor of graduation a flat in the city center. And his maternal grandparents, in an effort to keep up with their relatives, presented him with the keys to an expensive foreign car. Nicholas felt happy, all-powerful, independent. Ahead was a bright, happy life, friends, entertainment, beautiful girls. In this busy schedule, there was no room for studying. Nicholas almost did not appear at the university, so visited before the session to solve issues with teachers. It was a common thing in their university. Girls, Nicholas was now ashamed of his attitude to them. Then, in his student years, the guy considered them, probably, beautiful things, created especially for him and people like him. Nicholas did not consider the feelings of girls, did not listen to their desires, and chose his companions, like goods in a shop, purely on the basis of appearance. In his youth, he liked girls with modeling data, necessarily big eyes and relaxed, smiling. On the others, he simply did not look. The handsome, wealthy guy had no shortage of girlfriends. Girls themselves stick to him, came to get acquainted in a club or cafe, even waited at the door of the university and attracted the attention of some request. Naturally, under such circumstances, Nicholas felt himself a valuable prize. It seemed to him that everything was possible. Sometimes Nicholas got bored with easy relationships. He always liked difficult tasks, and he himself paid attention to some girl, himself tried to get her. It was sort of like a game of hunter and prey. Some girls for a while built themselves unattainable beauties, but Nicholas realized that the game had begun and used all his charm to break the resistance. He liked to feel himself as a miner, to create something like a beautiful fairy tale, a huge bouquet of roses, cute plush toys, exquisite jewelry, and also daring, reckless acts like a love song with a rock band under the windows of another beauty. Nicholas liked to invent something new, to surprise, to cause delight and admiration. And now the coldest beauty melts in his arms. When the game ended, Nicholas's interest quickly faded. Seemingly recently so mysterious, attractive girl suddenly became boring and uninteresting. Nicholas withdrew. He became dull, dreary. He did not tolerate grayness in his everyday life. To break up with another girl had to behave ugly. It was no longer as exciting and pleasant as the beginning of the relationship. But what can you do? Nicholas did not like women's tears. He was weighed down by long conversations and pleading. It was depressing and made him feel like a bad person. That's why Nicholas preferred the tactic of accusation. He always found something to accuse the passaic, unwilling to accept the separation. Everyone had their weaknesses. Yeah, maybe it was too harsh. It is possible that the girls after such antics appeared complexes, even psychological trauma. Well, how could they not? Otherwise they just kept up. Different situations happened in Nicholas's life. One of his former lovers, Cassandra, distinguished himself, especially after this story. Nicholas became much more careful with her. Nicholas met Cassandra at a nightclub. She was his type of girl, bright, beautiful, liberated. She danced so selflessly on the dance floor that it was impossible not to notice her. The girl was clearly already drunk. Her long hair fluttered beautifully as Cassandra turned in the dance. The girl was the center of attention and was clearly enjoying herself. Nicholas had just recently broken up with Ellie. They had been dating for almost 3 months, a record for a young man. And now the guy was in search of new adventures. Of course, he immediately decided that this evening he would leave the club only with her, with a beautiful girl in a daring miniskirt and sandals on a high platform. Cassandra looked even a little vulgar. Nicholas immediately realized that he would not be bored with this girl. Nicholas didn't approach her right away. He had to take a closer look first. He admired Cassandra for about an hour before he decided to get closer. The girl came to the club with her friends. They had long ago returned to their table, and Cassandra had not left the dance floor. She enjoyed the whole atmosphere of the club, the loud music, her own movements. It was very appealing to Nicholas. He just smiled at her. Catching her gaze, she froze for a moment. Her huge blue eyes appraised Nicholas from head to toe, and then their gazes met again. Nicholas admired the girl's face, which immediately caught his attention. She was even more beautiful up close than she looked from afar. Chiseled cheekbones, sharply defined lips, huge, simply bottomless eyes. The girl suddenly, without saying a word, came close to Nicholas. The guy, as enchanted, watched her graceful movements and waited for what would happen next. Beauty clearly took the initiative, and it was very interesting and unusual, not according to the script. Cassandra looked intently into Nicholas' eyes and kissed him. He, not believing what was happening, put his arms around the girl and pressed her against him. She did not object. Then they danced together. Nicholas realized that he was fascinated by this strange girl. He liked the light in her eyes, a kind of glimmer of light madness. He had never had a girl like her before. She was very different from the others. Then they met and learnt each other's names. Cassandra took him by the hand to the balcony. It was quiet and deserted. "I've never met anyone like you before," Nicholas told her admiringly. "That's not surprising. There just aren't any others like me," Cassandra smiled. Cassandra rented a room in the city. She had once come here from the countryside and had even managed to get into law school. But she'd never been much of a student, though she was certainly not lacking in ability. She just liked entertainment, socializing, dancing till morning in nightclubs, adventures. All this was not very well combined with the role of a diligent student. In her first year, the beautiful Cassandra fell in love with a young and charismatic history teacher, so much so that she couldn't think of anything but his gray eyes. The girl has always been characterized by a straightforward character. She was used to taking what she liked, and of course Cassandra did not hide her feelings from this young professor. He couldn't resist the young beauty's charms. The dean's office found out about it. The professor was forced to resign. Cassandra herself was expelled at the first opportunity. I must say it was not difficult, because the girl rarely attended lectures. In student life, she was attracted by a completely different side. The girl did not want to return to the village. It was boring and stuffy there. Since she was a little girl, she dreamed of breaking out of this swamp. But in the dormitory, which was provided only to students, after expulsion could not stay. So she had to get a job as a waitress in a bar. I had to get money for food and accommodation somewhere. The girl was hired unofficially. They needed beautiful waitresses to cheer up the customers. The pay was good. It was enough to rent a small flat, food, and even inexpensive but spectacular clothes from local economy-class boutiques. Cassandra was completely satisfied with this life. No dusty work, pleasant surroundings. It was a large bar. Every night there were a lot of guests, and local musicians, mostly rock bands and rock soloists, played on the stage. Cassandra liked the music. In general, she felt in her element here. Of course, the guests, staff, and musicians paid attention to the young beauty. In this bar, the girl met Michael, her first true love. He was the lead singer of the band that enjoyed the greatest success here. Soon they were living together. Michael showed Cassandra the world. They traveled to many American cities. Michael's band toured the country, playing gigs here in their hangouts, train stations, bars, and even concert halls. Then, as is often the case, Michael met another muse. Cassandra long experienced the parting, but then decided that it is not worth wasting her youth on longing and regret, especially since she again has an admirer. Cassandra consciously decided not to fall in love again. It hadn't done her any good twice. Now she was just living, enjoying companionship, youth, freedom, getting only pleasures from life and not thinking about the future. She was a little reckless, and that attracted Nicholas to her. He himself lacked her lightness and courage. Cassandra could drive after a bottle of champagne and speed past a police post. She fearlessly sat on the roofs of high-rise buildings with her long legs hanging down. Easy to get along with people. She even shoplifted not out of necessity, but out of excitement. There was a lot more. I can't list them all. Nicholas was never bored with her. He didn't know what to expect from the girl in the next moment, and it made his head spin. Cassandra wrote poetry and played the guitar masterfully. She also made witty jokes and sang beautifully. She invariably attracted people to her, a person celebrity next to whom one is never bored. And this amazing girl was head over heels in love with Nicholas, even though she had once vowed never to fall in love again. "You're special," Cassandra said more than once, looking at Nicholas earnestly. "You make me feel good. You understand me, my soul. You are the best." Nicholas melted at these words and really felt unique. It was nice to realize that Cassandra, who always attracted male gazes wherever she appeared, was so devoted to him. A beautiful rebel, she had many acquaintances. It seemed that the whole city her friends, but she didn't get close to anyone. To hang out, to go somewhere together, it's please. But she only opened her soul to Nicholas. Cassandra was no longer in touch with her parents, and they always wanted to mold her into something else, to remake her, to make her into someone she wasn't. What can I say, she sighed sadly. They wanted a son, and that's probably why they didn't like everything about me. Cassandra laughed too loudly and too loudly, talked too much and too fast. She was friends with the wrong people, didn't study hard enough, acted defiant. In general, the girl was picked on for every reason and no reason at all. That's why she decided to run away from home as early as possible, enter the university, and go to the city. The specialty for her daughter was chosen by her father. He decided that she must become a lawyer. Cassandra agreed. It was impossible to argue with a parent. And already in the city, breaking free from the total control of her mother and father, the girl finally decided to be herself, which she never regretted. They, when they learnt that I was expelled from the university, wanted to bring me back and bring me up again. But I imagined it. No way. I went against my father's will, and he said that in that case I was no longer their daughter and could no longer count on their help. Live, as you like, that's what he told me. And that's what I wanted. So I live as I know how and have no regrets. Nicholas marveled at Cassandra's stories. She was a year younger than he was. She had already experienced so much in her life, seen so much. As time passed, Cassandra and her endless parties began to bore Nicholas. Sometimes he wanted to spend the evening at home in front of the television, but the girl dragged him outside again and again. Then she was irresistibly drawn to a bar. Then she offered to jump into the river right off the bridge on the city embankment, or just walk around the city at night. The girl's adventurism, so attractive earlier, turned for Nicholas into her significant disadvantage. To live, never knowing what to expect from this reckless girl. Once it had thrilled and delighted him, now it irritated him. Cassandra loved Nicholas. The boy felt it, understood it, and assumed, of course, that parting with her would not be easy. But what followed next, he couldn't even imagine such a thing. Nicholas became more and more convinced that it was time to part with Cassandra. She'd been living in his flat for almost a year now. Her things were everywhere. Nicholas had no idea what it would be like for her to move out. She's packing her bags and going nowhere. It's a hard moment. He'd never asked a girl to move in with him before, or really been with anyone for that long. And he didn't know how to deal with the situation. Cassandra noticed something was wrong between them. "What's wrong with you?" "Me? What's going on between us?" she questioned. Nicholas kept silent, sometimes sighing sadly, preparing the ground. Let Cassandra figure out for herself what was going on. Maybe there would be no need to explain. And yet there was an explanation. It was on a December evening. Nicholas came home from university tired and angry. He was about to graduate. He had an uncooperative supervisor. This man flatly refused to take money and demanded serious work on the diploma. Nicholas was already physically unable to manage by the required date. And then there was Cassandra with her eternal carefree smile on her lips and untimely proposals. "What are you worried about?" "It's just a diploma," she shrugged her elegant shoulders. "People live without a diploma." And then Nicholas couldn't take it any longer. The resentment that had been building up for months came out. He shouted at Cassandra, called her selfish and empty, who lived at the expense of others and did not think about the future. There was so much pain and horror in the girl's eyes as she listened to this. "I'm sorry, I'll be what you want me to be," she said quietly as Nicholas finished his angry tirade. The boy was taken aback. This girl had fought for so long for the right to be herself and behave the way she wanted. And now, all of a sudden, this. Cassandra had said she was ready to remake herself to please him. But it's too late. "Cassandra, I'm sorry I yelled at you," Nicholas said, pulling himself together. "But we have to break up. I've wanted to tell you for a long time. I've been hesitant. Now it's just come to me somehow." "No," the girl exclaimed. She sounded desperate. She wasn't going to give up. "No, no, no." Cassandra threw the vase off the table. It hit the tiles on the floor and shattered into 1,000 small pieces. You can't do this. You can't drive me away. You can't push me away. We're adults. I love you more than anyone in this world. Don't you understand?" Nicholas looked at Cassandra, who was hysterical, and realized more and more clearly that she was really crazy. It had seemed so attractive and mysterious before, Now it was repulsive, frightening, pathetic, and unpleasant. "Go away," Nicholas said, standing with his back to the door. He tried to dodge her embrace. Cassandra clung to him like a drowning man clutching at straws. He managed then to shoo her out the door. Where will she go? Nicholas wasn't particularly worried about that. Cassandra had many acquaintances in the city and admirers too, who would gladly take her in. She wouldn't go to waste. Nicholas packed Cassandra's things into 2 large bags that evening. Cruel, of course. But he didn't have to put up with a crazy person around him if he'd been stupid enough to bring her into his home. One of Cassandra's friends took those things later. She contacted Nicholas herself. "How is she?" the guy asked, more out of politeness. By all the rules of social protocol, he had to ask that question. "She cries all the time. She doesn't want anything," she said sadly. Nicholas nodded. He hoped that Cassandra would soon be comforted and meet a new love. It had happened more than once in her life. A matter of routine for her, but Cassandra was not comforted. Moreover, she began to pursue Nicholas with her usual obsession. One day Cassandra showed up at the university dressed like a nun, a mournful look, a floor-length skirt, and a headscarf over her beautiful hair. "I'm changing for you," she said quietly, looking at Nicholas. "You see, I'm trying hard. I am different now, submissive, obedient. I will do whatever you tell me to do." It wasn't just frightening. It cost Nicholas a lot of trouble to get her out then. It was more than that. Confessions of love and pleas for forgiveness began to appear on the walls of the entrance to Nicholas's flat. Cassandra also flooded the guy with emails and paper letters. Some of them were even written in verse. Wherever Nicholas went, he would bump into her, whether it was a shopping center, a cafe, a bar, or just a park. Cassandra stalked him, begged for his attention, even threatened him. Nicholas didn't know where to get away from her. Persuasion didn't work. Cassandra didn't listen to him. She kept pushing her line, and it was frightening. One day she attacked him. Nicholas had just finished his degree. He was on his way home from a celebration of this long-awaited event. It was very late, not a soul in the street. Nicholas got out of the taxi and paid the driver. In a complacent mood, he headed for his driveway. Cassandra came at him like a fury, dressed in all black and therefore indistinguishable against the night landscape. "If you don't want to be with me, then no one else will have you," she shouted and attacked Nicholas. He, from surprise, did not even immediately begin to resist. The girl at that moment possessed some truly inhuman strength. But she did not take into account the main thing: he was still a man, and therefore physically stronger. Nicholas, of course, managed to push the attacker away from him. Cassandra fell to the pavement, hitting her back hard. "What are you doing?" Nicholas exclaimed. "You're out of your mind. Get better." "I'm sorry," Cassandra whispered. Large tears ran down her cheeks. "I don't know what came over me. I love you. How could I?" Nicholas disappeared down the driveway, slamming the door loudly. His heart was troubled now. Cassandra had made a mistake today. This attempt was doomed to failure beforehand. What if next time she threw a knife at him? Girls are capable of terrible things. Nicholas was in an unenviable position. The very next day he received a phone call from Cassandra's friend, who had picked up her things and told him in a broken voice that Cassie had tried to kill herself. The girl had failed. The rope broke at the last moment. She was spotted in time. The ambulance arrived very quickly, but now Cassandra is in intensive care. Nicholas didn't know what to do. He felt guilty about what had happened to this girl. On the other hand, the guy was still afraid of her horrible, unpleasant feelings. Everything ended happily for Nicholas. Cassandra survived, but she was diagnosed with an illness that developed due to extreme stress. The guy preferred not to think about what exactly was the cause of that very stress. Cassie was sent to a closed clinic. From mutual friends, Nicholas learned that her parents now visit her. Apparently, they realized that they needed their dysfunctional daughter. Friends also sometimes went to Cassandra in the hospital, but Nicholas never met her again. And in general, he really wanted to forget the whole heavy story. But he couldn't. That was probably the first time he thought about the fact that he wasn't acting right with girls. For him, they were just things beautiful and valuable, but things. How many women's tears were shed because of him? He never considered the feelings of his girlfriends. They, many of them, loved him so sincerely. Nicholas had become much more careful since then. Now he listened more carefully to the girls, noticed a lot of things, tried to be more sensitive and alert. And he always kept a safe distance. Easy, not burdensome romances, pre-agreed terms. No romance, but no surprises. He'd had enough of Cassandra. Nicholas graduated from university. His father got him a good position at the local city forming enterprise, a gas plant. The salary was more than decent. The career prospects are impressive. Nicholas plunged into work. He was an unimportant student, but he turned out to be a great employee. The guy delved into all the nuances, engaged in self-education, looked at more experienced colleagues. As for his personal life, Nicholas has not yet thought about any serious relationships. He actively tried to match girls from decent families. But Nicholas was adamant. He did not want to get married, and even less children. It seemed that he had not yet gained enough experience. He lived in his own pleasure, and he did not need unnecessary problems. The story of Cassandra was still fresh in his mind. A superficial relationship where everyone understood everything from the start. Romances without prospects, arising only for easy and pleasant pastime. It suited Nicholas just fine. It went on like this for several years. Nicholas had established himself in his profession. Now he was in good standing in his company. He was respected. The young specialist was promoted up the career ladder, and this was already the result of his merits, and not a consequence of the troubles of an authoritative father. By the way, his parents were very proud of their son. They did not think that he would be good. He behaved in his youth like a typical major. The son of rich daddy did not study, lived life, thoughtlessly spent money. His mom and dad couldn't get through to him at the time. And then suddenly Nicholas seemed to grow up and took up the mind. His parents were happy about it. And for complete happiness, they lacked only one thing: that the son married, had a family, gave them grandchildren. However, Nicholas was still very young, so his mother and father did not insist. And then Bridget came into Nicholas's life. Bridget came to the office on business. She was an economist for a partnership organization, and there were some accounting issues, so Bridget was sent to look into it. Nicholas bumped into her at the entrance. He was in a hurry to get to the car park. He'd been called into the office, and there she was, Bridget. This girl wasn't Nicholas' type at all. She was pretty, but she wasn't a model. Short, very thin, short haircut. Careful gray eyes, freckles on her nose, thin lips. In some ways, she reminded him of an elf from a fairy tale. Nicholas, not knowing why he stopped. Looking at the visitor, she absent-mindedly glanced at him and hurried on. In her hands, the girl clutched a folder with documents, and Nicholas, though in a hurry, followed her. On his own, not yet aware of his actions, just on a hunch. He did not go in vain. On the third floor, the elf girl stopped and began to look around confusedly. She was clearly lost. No wonder their office was a labyrinth. The intricacy of stairs, corridors confuses newcomers. "Did you lose something?" Nicholas turned to the girl with a smile. He was glad to be able to talk to her on such a plausible pretext. Yes, the beautiful stranger smiled back. "I need to go to the accounting department, and I'm kind of lost. I'd be happy to walk you out." Nicholas deliberately led her the longest way. On the way, they got to know each other talking. Bridget talked easily and casually, as if she'd known Nicholas for years, a manner that appealed to him. He didn't want to leave her. When the door of the accounting office loomed on the horizon. "Well, here we are," Nicholas said with a slight disappointment in his voice. "To be honest, I don't want to let you go in there." "Why are the female employees there so angry?" Bridget joked. "It's not that. It's just that I have to leave right now. And when I get back, he'll be gone. And I don't want to break up now and never see you again, you know." "I understand," she nodded, and then added, "I feel the same way." After these words, Nicholas felt as if a warm wave had swept over him. His soul became light and easy. The world around him shone with bright colors. She likes him too. It's a real happiness. Nicholas suddenly wanted to hug her tightly and spin round the corridor. but it was probably too early for such a hug. "That's nice to hear," Nicholas said in a low-key voice, but his shining eyes no doubt conveyed the joy he felt at her words. Nicholas asked for Bridget's phone, and she handed him her mobile phone. The boy quickly dialed his number from it and made a call. "There," he smiled at the girl. "Now we're in touch. I will definitely call you." "I'll be waiting," the girl replied seriously. And he made the call. Of course, he called the same day. As soon as he returned from the department, he reported to the general. There were still a few hours left before the end of the working day. Bridget finished a little later than Nicholas. They'd arranged for the guy to pick her up at work tonight. So he did. He arrived a little before the agreed time and sat in the car for a long time, looking carefully at the porch of the office building. People were coming out of the doors, one by one and in groups, but Bridget was not among them. And then she appeared. Nicholas jumped out of the car and rushed to meet her. At first they sat in the cafe for a while, getting to know each other better, telling each other important things about themselves. Bridget lived with her mother in a small flat in the new buildings. She had graduated in economics from the local university. Nicholas was also studying there. Perhaps if he had attended classes more often, he would have met Bridget earlier, but it's unlikely he would have been interested in her then. The guy at that time attracted only girls with modeling looks. And not so long ago it was the same. Nicholas himself now did not understand why he was so struck by Bridget. Outwardly, it was absolutely not his type. But it was incredibly pleasant and easy to communicate with her. He and Bridget were very different. Nicholas confidently went through life, liked noisy companies, was not afraid to tell people the truth to their faces, even if it offended them. He did not like to understand the feelings of others and was characterized by straightforwardness. Bridget, on the other hand, was very delicate. She was afraid of hurting others and very sensitive to changes in people's moods. Calm, peaceful, serious, hardworking, and incredibly responsible. A little bit fearful, but at the same time capable of doing a lot for the sake of achieving her goals. Nicholas and Bridget. They seemed to complement each other, like two halves of one whole. They so different were drawn to each other with an irresistible force. They didn't want to be apart at all, so they walked late into the night, just holding hands, and sat snuggled together in the car. Bridget loved museums and exhibitions. She also liked leisurely walks, intimate conversations, trips out of town to places where you can quietly admire nature. Nicholas, however, showed her a different world. He dragged Bridget to rock concerts, invited her to his noisy, cheerful company. Bridget was also very interested in all this. Nicholas knew for sure that she was not lying, not trying to pretend joy to please him. For one thing, they had had complete sincerity with each other from the beginning. Therefore, Bridget would not hide her feelings. Secondly, Nicholas could see her eyes. There was admiration, delight, and interest in them. Nicholas felt happy to be with her and thanked fate that he had bumped into Bridget at the door and did not pass by. The boy met Bridget's mother. She turned out to be a pleasant woman, the same age as his parents. She made incredibly fragrant tea from some country herbs and baked mind-boggling cakes. Bridget kept complaining that she couldn't do it, but Nicholas was ready to forgive her inability to cook and not adapted to housekeeping. And her shyness made him fond of her. Nicholas did not know how to suggest that Bridget come to live with him. After Cassandra, he'd never invited anyone to live with him. Of course, the logical thing to do would be to ask Bridget to marry him. They'd been dating for almost a year. Both of them were of a suitable age for marriage. But Nicholas was still hesitant. He was afraid to take such an important step. There were many reasons for this. From an early age, his parents had warned their son against a rash marriage. "You are a prominent guy, a wealthy groom, more than enviable," instructed the heir mother. "You will be surrounded by girls who want to marry for profit. They will marry a rich guy first, then divorce him and legally claim his money and property. Do you know how many such stories there are? Be careful." It wasn't that Nicholas suspected Bridget of being self-serving. No, he'd never thought of her that way. But the idea that marriage is an incredibly responsible and deliberate decision. And it shouldn't be rushed. And what's the rush, really? They're both still young enough. It is necessary to live in their own pleasure, have fun, travel. And the wedding, the stamp and the passport and other conventions, it can wait. Besides, Nicholas still didn't want to deprive himself of a way out. Yes, he and Bridget were perfect now, but who knew what would happen next? No, Nicholas loved Bridget, and he was well aware of that. He'd never felt this strongly about anyone before. But who knew what lay ahead? His history with Cassandra had made him very cautious. Besides, marriage presupposes the birth of children. And Nicholas wasn't exactly ready for that. Taking on that kind of responsibility? Oh no, he hadn't had his fill yet. There's so much more interesting in life, and without these nappies and cradles. Nicholas had the example of his married friends in front of him. With the arrival of children, relations between young spouses changed, and most often not for the better. Newly married parents were tired. All their time devoted only to the kids, began to accuse each other on domestic issues and quarrel over the distribution of household chores. It was as if they stopped living for themselves. Such people talked only about children who went when, what talents have, what prams are better to choose, and so on. These conversations made Nicholas terribly sad. No, he was not yet ready for fatherhood. He wanted to live for himself and enjoy his youth without devoting all his time to crying babies. Someday later, in the distant future, Nicholas saw himself as a father, but certainly not in the next 5 to 7 years. Anyway, while Nicholas was pondering how to suggest that Bridget move in with him, skirting the issue of marriage, she herself brought up the subject of living together. Nicholas felt like a complete fool, having pondered the subject so much, made plans, and agonized over the doubts. All that was required was to talk frankly with Bridget, as usual. I know I shouldn't be saying this, but I would love to fall asleep and wake up in your arms. And you'd make it easier for me to get to work, Bridget said. Nicholas glowed. It was an easy solution to a question he'd been pondering for a long time. It was as if Bridget had read his mind. Or perhaps she had. Now they were apart only when they were working. Nicholas and Bridget lived together as a family. At first, of course, there was an adjustment phase. Bridget was not at all self-sufficient in the home. Well, that's understandable, she lived with her mother. Nicholas taught her a lot of things, cooking, quickly tidying up her rooms. It was fun and very sweet. It seemed to bring Bridget and Nicholas even closer together. Bridget proved to be a capable student who quickly surpassed her teacher. She loved cooking complex, unusual dishes. Maybe it's time for you to change careers, jokingly suggested Nicholas, tasting another gastronomic masterpiece of the girl. Such talents cannot be hidden from a wide audience. Maybe I will change my profession, Bridget replied, almost seriously. But not now. When I have free time, I'll open my own restaurant. That would be great. Over time, Bridget and Nicholas's friends got to know each other and joined forces. They made a very good group. The young people liked to go out together to the forest, to the river, to a tourist trip. And sometimes they gathered at someone's house and played board games. Nicholas had never imagined that it was so exciting and fun. He thought board games were only for children, but no. One of Bridget's friends, Margaret, always looked at Nicholas in a special way. It confused him a little. Is this your Margaret? Is she all right with me? Nicholas ventured to ask Bridget one day. It's all right, she smiled. It's just that you look incredibly similar to a guy Margaret was once very much in love with. There's such an ugly story there. Margaret followed him around, practically begging for attention, but he just laughed and ostentatiously dated other girls. He had a right, of course, he didn't have to have an affair with her, even if she was head over heels in love with him. But he was too cruel and ugly with her. And Margaret continued to love him and suffer. Yeah, drama. Well, we were very young then, just out of high school. You can forgive stupidity when you're young. I never even met him. Margaret only told me about this bloke. And then the other day she told me that you look just like him. It's such a strange coincidence. How did that story end? Oh, it didn't end much. The bloke went off to New York to find happiness, taking his next fling with him. Margaret suffered, looking for him on social media. Then somehow she let it go. At least she started paying attention to other guys. It was like the story was forgotten. And then suddenly I have you. And what, I look so much like him? Nicholas asked. very much, Bridget answered. He was handsome too, according to Margaret. But the resemblance is only superficial. You're a kind, sensitive, deep person, and he's an egoist, a superficial empty shell. I can't believe Margaret didn't see it at first. She's not a shallow girl. Nicholas sighed. Bridget had not known him in his youth, and he was no better than Margaret's lover. He'd also spared no one else's feelings and manipulated girls. Cassandra came to mind again. Where is she now? What's wrong with her? Nicholas shook his head, pushing the unpleasant thoughts away. Nicholas and Bridget lived soul to soul, walking, traveling, meeting friends, shopping together as a married couple, supporting each other in all situations, taking care of each other. With all this, Nicholas felt free. Bridget was comfortable with the fact that sometimes he went out with his friends. She could just as well spend the evening with her friends in a bar or club, and Nicholas wasn't jealous at all. He was sure that Bridget would not do anything wrong, would not betray him. And so it went on for several years. Nicholas and Bridget sometimes thought about the future. Bridget dreamed of having children. She already wanted to be a mother. Nicholas saw this, but he was not yet ready for parenthood. I have a lot to do before I have a baby, he reasoned. Both in terms of career and in general, I dreamed to go on tour in Africa, to learn to fly an aeroplane, to open my own business. All this will be problematic. With children on my hands, I still have unrealized dreams and unfulfilled plans, so I'm not ready for children yet. That's a shame, Bridget sighed. I've wanted a baby for a long time, a baby you and me. But if you're not ready, I'll wait. I want this child to be a joy for both of us. I won't take any other option, Bridget said. Nicholas was glad that she understood and accepted his decision. He was willing to do a lot of things for her, but not a child. At least not yet. But fate, as it usually happens, had its own way. One day, Bridget gave Nicholas news that turned his happy and carefree life upside down. Nicholas, we need to have a serious talk. Is something wrong? She said. Nicholas felt a slight unease. Bridget looked too confused and pale. Perhaps she was seriously ill. What's wrong? He asked. I don't know how to tell you, Bridget answered. Nicholas suddenly thought she was leaving him. Fear squeezed his heart with an icy hand. Not this, he wasn't ready to lose Bridget, but what if she's met someone else? Speak plainly, sincerely, as always. It's hard for me to talk about this. I know how you feel about it. Anyway, I'm expecting a baby. What? Nicholas was hit over the head with a sandbag. The news had a profound effect on him. He felt a slow wave of panic coming over him. Parenthood was scaring him. I don't know how it happened. I mean, we were using protection. But it happens. I've already been to the doctor, and he said there's no one way to be sure. So, Bridget, you know I can't be a father right now, don't you? Nicholas said softly, looking her in the eye. I'm starting to develop my business, and I have a long business trip coming up. And anyway, there are so many plans not yet realized. It's no time for a baby. No time at all. Bridget lowered her eyes. I know. But this baby, it's already here, you know. They even let me hear its heartbeat. It's such a miracle. I know how much you want it, but I can't, Nicholas replied. You don't have to be afraid. Bridget took his hands and looked into his eyes. Everything will be fine. Just think, we have everything to make this baby happy. The flat, the job, the money, it's all there, Bridget said. Lots of people give birth in much more cramped conditions and still manage. We'll be happy too. There's no need to be afraid, we're together. Nicholas shook his head. The image of his friend, who had recently become a father, suddenly appeared before his eyes. Mussed hair, stained t-shirt, sleep-deprived eyes, and a stupid, meaningless smile on his face. No, Nicholas didn't want to become like that. Then he started insisting on terminating the pregnancy. It was hard to say even the word himself, looking Bridget in the eyes. But what could be done? It was about his freedom and peace of mind. Besides, it wasn't like he'd given up on the idea of having a baby altogether. No, of course not. He and Bridget would have children someday. But not now. Definitely not now. How could she not understand? They've talked about it so many times, and they've all agreed to take it slow. Do you even realize what you're offering me? There was steel in Bridget's voice. It was hard for her too. I do, but it happens. Medicine is so advanced these days. You're still young, so it'll be quick and painless. And there will be no consequences, Nicholas replied. He realized that he was saying very scary words, but he could not do otherwise. And he had a say in the matter too, because the baby would change his world completely. Bridget must reckon with him. And she was looking at him like a complete stranger. There was pain and disappointment and disbelief in her eyes. You scare me, Bridget said. You scare me so much. You should know how you scare me. Nicholas suddenly remembered his mother's old words, her warnings about cunning girls who get pregnant and marry wealthy men, and then string them along. You just want me to marry you. Are you like everyone else? He said. Without another word, Bridget turned round and sprinted out of the flat. She only had time to grab her car keys. Nicholas immediately realized that he'd said too much. Of course, Bridget wasn't like that. He shouldn't have hurt her. On the other hand, she should realize that there would be no baby. Nicholas was too young to be a father, and he'd told her that many times. And she'd either lukewarmly agreed or just pretended to agree. Nicholas jumped out onto the balcony. He was about to call Bridget back. They will discuss everything calmly and come to the conclusion that there is no hurry. Nicholas will even apologize for his harsh words. He really loves Bridget. She's the closest thing he has to family, no matter what. But Bridget didn't even turn round at his shout, offended. She got into the car, slammed the door loudly, and sped away. Nothing, Nicholas muttered under his breath. She'll cool down, weigh the pros and cons, and come back. You can't be without me. And I know you love me, and I love you, and we'll still be together. Nicholas took a bottle of cognac from the bar and opened it. He needed to relax now. The strong drink made everything that was happening not so scary. The world became simpler and clearer for a while. Nicholas texted Bridget a conciliatory text. He apologized for his harsh words, confessed his love, and called for negotiations. The guy was probably even willing to discuss the baby issue, since it was so important to Bridget. He would probably make that sacrifice. After all, it's unlikely he'll ever meet a more suitable girl than her. He can't be without her, no matter what. Nicholas was even now sorely lacking his soulmate. Yes, things hadn't gone according to plan, which was why he was scared. The news just confused him. But he pondered, weighed, and planned anyway. He and Bridget would be fine, just as long as she would move away sooner and forgive him for his cruel words. Nicholas dialed her number several times. That night, the girl didn't answer. It was understandable she was offended, maybe even crying. Nicholas cringed. It was unbearable to realize himself in the role of torturer of the person he loved. He wanted to give Bridget joy, to make her smile, to make her happy. But as it happened, he was the cause of her tears. Nicholas knew how to remedy the situation. He spent the whole evening thinking about his situation and accepted Bridget's decision, accepted her point of view. Yes, Nicholas would do anything to make his beloved happy, no matter what it cost him. Now, as Bridget drifted away from him in her car to an unknown destination, Nicholas realized clearly that he needed her. Needed her badly, vitally needed her. He wished she'd cool down and take his call. That night, Nicholas couldn't sleep. Bridget never showed up. She didn't answer his messages or his calls. She was hurt. For the first time in her life, she was so offended she didn't even want to hear from him. Nicholas was watching a show on TV and absent-mindedly flipping through the city news feed on his phone. Suddenly, he saw a report about an accident on the motorway that had happened recently. There were photos from the scene. Nicholas looked at Bridget's wrecked car with horror. He himself gave this car to his beloved when she passed the license. It was a little over a year ago. Bridget was very embarrassed then too expensive gift, but Nicholas was adamant and she had to give in. She loved the car so much, called it her swallow, and took it to the car wash far more often than necessary. Nicholas was still hoping for a mistake. There aren't many white cars like this in the city. But the ballerina cat suspension on the broken windshield. Nicholas bought it in Chicago, where he'd recently been sent on a business trip. Chances are slim that anyone else in their city has one. It's Bridget's car. Nicholas frantically searched for information about the accident. There wasn't much information yet. It seemed that the driver had lost control and hit a road barrier at high speed. Bridget was always careful behind the wheel. Nicholas even laughed at her slowness. It was unlikely that she would speed up on the motorway. It wasn't like her at all. Except that Bridget had been in a terrible state when she'd run away from him the day before. Why didn't he think to stop her? Grab her hand, hold her close, apologize, never let her go. The driver was hospitalized in a regional hospital in serious condition, Nicholas read under the terrible photo. In serious condition, but alive. Nicholas was already calling a taxi to go to the regional hospital. It was late at night. The sleepy girl at the reception desk asked who Nicholas was to the victim. On hearing that he was her flatmate, what an unpleasant word. The nurse said with a tinge of regret in her voice that in that case she had no right to divulge information about the patient. That's if you were married. Nicholas grinned bitterly. He wasn't going to leave the walls of the hospital. He kept walking around, trying to look in the windows until a guard chased him away. But the boy didn't give up. He went again to the lobby of the clinic, determined to find out something about Bridget's condition. That's where he ran into her mother. They rushed over to each other, hugged. The woman looked confused, frightened, and crying, which was not surprising, really. She knew nothing about her daughter's quarrel with Nicholas, had no idea about it. Otherwise, she probably wouldn't have spoken to him. It's all my fault, isn't it? I'm the one to blame for what happened, Nicholas thought. How is Bridget? They won't tell me anything, Nicholas asked. In intensive care, Bridget's mother sobbed. She's undergoing surgery right now. Her condition is critical. The doctor says there's not much hope. Did you know Bridget was expecting a baby? Nicholas nodded. Well, the baby, of course, was not saved, the woman continued. The doctors are fighting for her life. I wonder how happy you would have been if you hadn't had that accident, if you were expecting a baby. I would have been happy for you. Nicholas nodded at Bridget's mother's words, not noticing the tears running down his cheeks. Bridget's mother signed some papers, and Nicholas was allowed to see the girl in the intensive care unit, only for a short time. He sat next to the seemingly sleeping Bridget, entangled in wires, holding her hand and talking. He apologized, begged her to wake up, promised that as soon as she came to her senses, they would marry and start planning children. Painting pictures of a beautiful future together in the hope that these prospects would make Bridget come round. After all, she had something to come back for. Happiness was so close. Why didn't I realize it at once? Nicholas chastised himself. How could I have spoken so harshly to the person I loved? It was unbearable to realize that Bridget was in this state because of him. After all, that was why she'd driven at breakneck speed down the motorway, just because of their stupid argument. Usually Bridget drove very carefully, but here, no one knew it was Nicholas's fault, but that didn't make him feel any better. His only wish was that Bridget would wake up after the terrible accident. She would never be the same again, but it didn't matter. Nicholas would be there for her. He would be her arms and legs if he had to, just to see her favorite eyes and hear her voice again. But the miracle didn't happen. Bridget never recovered. One night she was gone. There was nothing the doctors could do. Nicholas didn't want anything. He forgot to eat, stopped going to work, didn't answer his friends' calls. Life went black, lost all meaning. And then there was the guilt. It sometimes overwhelmed Nicholas to the point where he couldn't breathe. He even thought about ending his suffering all at once. Why should he live? Nothing good would ever happen again, because nothing would ever bring Bridget back to him. And he didn't deserve to be happy. Wasn't it because of his stupid fear that his beloved wasn't alive? Not alive at all. She loved life so much, she dreamed of that baby. Parents hired a famous doctor for Nicholas, but he could not help the guy. He said some general phrases, tried to be clever. But this man, he didn't know the whole truth. Nicholas could not tell anyone about his guilt. It was too hard, too scary. Then one day Nicholas met Margaret, Bridget's friend, by chance as he was walking home from the shop. Now he only went as far as the nearest liquor shop and straight home. The booze was at least a little mind-numbing and distracting. Margaret looked at Nicholas with sympathy and regret. She herself had suffered the loss of her best friend. She and Bridget had been very close, but after hearing Nicholas' condition, Margaret had come to support him. Amazing man. The guy didn't mind her company and invited the girl to his place. They sat at the table, remembered Bridget cried. And Nicholas suddenly decided to revelations. He told Margaret the truth, told her all about his nightmarish behavior before the fatal accident. So it's all my fault, the boy concluded. He thought Margaret would start insulting and berating him. It would have been natural and fair, but she took pity on him. It's unbelievable. It's not your fault, she said. It's just the way things are. Margaret stroked Nicholas's head as if he were a baby. It made him feel better. You were just scared. And Bridget? She was scared and confused too. You didn't want this, did you? Neither did she. It rained that day, the road was slippery. It wasn't your fault. It was a coincidence, Margaret said. She'd helped Nicholas better than an expensive counselor. They called each other now, sometimes talking, and these conversations had a soul-saving effect on Nicholas. The guy came round, went back to work. Gradually, he climbed out of the deep black hole in which he spent a long time. Parents rejoiced. Colleagues and friends noted that Nicholas was becoming the same. They were all wrong. Nicholas knew for sure that now he would never be the same again. It had been many years since that terrible day. He was still counting down the age of his and Bridget's baby boy. If he'd been born in time, he'd be 14 by now. Seeing boys his son's age on the street, the man couldn't help but wonder what his child would have been like. Now these memories came back again. There was no escape from them. Of course, that acute pain, as in the first time after the tragedy, is no longer there. But the longing and sadness of the unfulfilled is now forever with Nicholas. Has he come to terms with it? Nicholas had not met a woman remotely resembling Bridget, as he had hoped. There was probably no such woman in the world, and he wouldn't settle for anything less, especially after he'd known true love, the kind that only comes once in a lifetime, and some people probably never have it at all. Nicholas was about to get out of the car to go to the supermarket, when suddenly a little boy of 3 years old caught his attention. A tiny boy in a shirt, obviously off someone else's shoulder, was scurrying around the rubbish bins. The child stood on top of the bins, otherwise he couldn't reach the edge of the bin. With his little hands, he busily picked through the leftover food in the bin. There was a restaurant in the mall, so there was often food in the bin. All the homeless people in the area knew this, so you could often spot people hunting for scraps near the bins. Most of the time it was adults or teenagers, but this one was just a baby. They shouldn't be out on the street without a parent. Maybe his mother or father was around. Nicholas looked around. No, there were no adults around. The boy was walking on his own, and judging by his confident and businesslike movements, this was not the first time this had happened to him. Strange and very suspicious. Nicholas couldn't leave this child unattended any longer. There was no telling what could happen to such a baby. If he falls into a rubbish bin, he won't be able to get out. And then there are big stray dogs, bad people, fast cars. There's a lot of dangers for a kid on the street. Maybe we should call the police. Let them deal with it, he thought, but immediately discarded the idea. What if that call would somehow harm the child? One had to be careful in such matters. The baby, meanwhile, had finished his business in the rubbish bin. Grabbing a bag of leftovers, he awkwardly climbed down from the crates and headed somewhere, chewing on a crust of bread. Nicholas's heart snapped with pity. Such a small child walking clumsily, but already he had to fend for himself. It was not from a good life that the child went into the rubbish bins. Nicholas couldn't let the situation go unnoticed. He slipped out of the car and followed the child. The boy headed confidently towards the road. Adults hurried past without noticing the little man. Only occasionally someone threw a surprised look at the boy and went on. Such indifference was astonishing. A small child is all alone in the street, and no one cares. However, perhaps they thought that the kid was following one of the adults. The boy turned down a narrow alley. Nicholas followed him for another couple of 100 meters, and the child found himself in the private sector. He had never been in this place before. Wow, almost the center of the city. Only 100 meters away from here was the main street with a well-kept square, luxurious fountains and wide pavement. And here is poverty, desolation, dust, rubbish. The boy approached the old gate. Behind the fence he could see a garden overgrown with weeds, in the back of which there was a long, unpainted house with shabby roofs. The boy pushed open the old door and slipped through the gap. Nicholas watched outside to see what would happen next. Are the adults here waiting for the baby? And why would they let such a babe go alone? The boy ran into the porch and disappeared behind the ajar front door. Nicholas stood for a moment in indecision. The child was home. Nothing had happened to him. It would be safe to go back. Think of it as seeing the kid off, making sure he didn't get in trouble. That's it. But Nicholas' heart was still restless. He felt sorry for the boy. The unknown was frightening. What if the child is not well? What if he's in danger? So Nicholas knocked on the gate. He couldn't find a bell, so he had to use force. A minute later, an old man appeared on the porch. He was thin, short, in knee-high sweatpants and a stale t-shirt, overgrown with stubble, with a swollen face of an unhealthy red hue. Swollen eyes, a cloudy look, everything is clear. This man is either drunk or hungover. "Are you here to see me?" the grandfather asked in a hoarse voice. "I'm here to see you," Nicholas confirmed. "And what was the question?" "About the kid who just came home. He was out alone." The old man's voice was threatening. "Did my ails do something again?" "No," Nicholas hastened to reassure. The gate was not locked at the entrance. The yard was a sort of dump, a mountain of rubbish and broken bricks. Beer cans and bottles of cheap liquor everywhere. And suddenly, in the midst of all this chaos, a makeshift sandbox. "What do you want?" asked the old man, not very politely. "I just thought you might need some help." A child alone on the street at that age. I caught him by the rubbish bins outside the shopping center. He was looking for food. How many times have I told Alex, "Don't go out there alone," he wouldn't listen. The kid was looking for food, Nicholas said. He was obviously very hungry. "Who is he to you? What does he look like?" asked the old man. "A grandson," he answered. "My only grandson. And you are right, good man. He and I could really use some help. I can't work because of my age." "Where are his parents?" Nicholas asked, but the old man relaxed. "I'd like to know that myself. Who is Alex's father?" "I don't know. My daughter Gwen herself was confused when she got pregnant young. And Gwen herself, the boy's mother, is off somewhere. I haven't heard from her in 3 months." "And you didn't sound the alarm?" Nicholas was surprised. "If something has happened to my daughter, what can she do?" the old man said with a wave of his hand. "It's not the first time she's gone far away either. They say she's a fickle woman and doesn't know her mother. Gwen started drinking when she was 15, and then she went downhill. She had a baby, settled down a bit, and then she went off again. I can't understand how boring her life is, babysitting a baby. So I had my grandchild with me. It's safer with me. And Gwen. No hope for her. She would have killed her son long ago." Nicholas raised his eyebrows in surprise. If the child was better off with this obviously drunk man, what kind of mother was there? "So there's nothing to worry about," the old man continued. "If anything had happened, one of her friends would have told me by now. Here you say to sound the alarm, to look for the daughter. I'd have Alex taken away from me and put in an orphanage in a heartbeat. If they find out about his mom, and him, he's already attached to me, and me to him, and will the boy be able to be there without me?" Nicholas had very different thoughts on the subject. He thought the child would be much better off in an orphanage than in a broken-down house with a drunken grandfather. And they fed them well. "Alex won't have to think about his own food," said the grandfather. "Who's that?" A boy jumped out on the porch. A little boy. He's funny. His black olive eyes scrutinized the intruder. Nicholas smiled at the little boy. He was so touching, so defenseless. The man realized that he couldn't just walk away and forget this child. He himself did not understand what was happening to him. Only Nicholas suddenly wanted to shelter the baby from all the troubles and misfortunes that fell on his shaggy head. "It's a good uncle," explained the old man. "He wants to help us." "Are you hungry?" Nicholas asked, trying to keep his voice as soft as possible. Alex shook his head in the negative. "We have plenty of food at home. I brought it. Would you like to eat with us?" Nicholas immediately went to the nearest shop and bought 2 bags of food for Alex and his grandfather. There was meat, fruit, and sweets for the baby, and cheap plastic toys from a street shop. They gave Alex a special thrill. Nicholas thought a lot about that chance encounter afterwards. Alex is in danger with relatives like that, but his grandfather is also right. In an orphanage, the little boy will be even worse off. Alex is so sensitive, vulnerable, touching. He needs love and attention. His grandfather loves him in his own way. The boy feels it. It will be very hard for him in the orphanage. Nicholas now often visited Alex, brought food, toys, and books. With pleasure he communicated, played with the boy, talked with his grandfather about life. The man could not leave the baby without supervision. Somehow, imperceptibly, this child became Nicholas, far from being a stranger. The boy's grandfather still drank alone or in the company of drinking buddies. These were seemingly peaceful, harmless people, not hooligans. They treated Alex with warmth and participation. No one offended the boy. Still, it was no good for a child to be in such a place. Alex's mother never showed up. She seemed to have forgotten about the existence of her son and father. "Let him go for a walk." The old man waved his hand when Nicholas asked him about his daughter. "If she doesn't show up, it means that everything is fine with her. She'll come straight back when she's in a tight spot." It's happened more than once. Nicholas tried to get Alex's granddad into hospital. Of course, he's a very old man, but what if the treatment will help, and the old man will stop drinking, will take up the upbringing of his grandson? Miracles happen. Not in this case. The grandfather flatly refused treatment and assured that he was fine. What's the big deal? There's a house, there's food in the fridge. Not everyone has such a rich life. Most of the country is as poor as Alex and me. Don't make a tragedy out of nothing. You're helping a boy from a poor family. Well, thank you very much. We need your contribution, but mind your own business. The old man couldn't accept that he was doing something wrong. In his worldview, this was the norm. Everyone lived like that. Nicholas continued to visit Alex and help the family with groceries. He himself did not understand why he suddenly became so attached to the boy. Perhaps he saw in him his unborn son. The boy was drawn to Nicholas. He loved him with all his soul. He even made some crafts for him. It was very sweet. Nicholas found himself looking forward to Friday all week. That was the day he'd visit Alex and his grandfather, and no business could distract him from his visit. The old man had Nicholas's phone number. He'd left it with him, just in case he needed help in a hurry. But the grandfather never bothered him, and now he called in the middle of the week. "We're in trouble," Grandpa said. "Alex is being taken away from me." Nicholas immediately rushed to the familiar house. He was very worried about Alex. Something might have happened to the boy. The old man hadn't really explained where they were taking him. Maybe to a hospital. But Alex turned out to be fine. He sat on his grandfather's lap and looked fearfully at the 2 women in police uniform. When he saw Nicholas, Alex burst into tears again, probably from relief this time. And there was so much hope in his dark eyes for his good uncle. "You promised," Nicholas stroked his head. "Grandfather said that Uncle Nicholas would come and everything would be all right." "What's the matter?" Nicholas asked the police officers. "We're trying to remove the child to give him to an institution," explained one of the women. "And this man, who claims to be the boy's grandfather, just won't give him up. He makes the child nervous. The boy is afraid of us now. He's clinging to his grandfather and won't come to us," said another woman. "Gwen is dead," the old man explained from his corner. Tears came to his eyes, but he forced them back. Turns out there was a fire in the garage with some mates a week ago. They were drinking there and listening to music in the car. And now to the orphanage, because I'm nobody to him by documents, and I won't give him away. You can't take him away from his own grandfather. So that's it. Alex is an orphan now. I don't think they'll leave him to his grandfather. He's not the right age, and he's not the right way of life. But you can't put him in an orphanage. He'd break down. He's a free, loving, curious kid who needs love and attention. It won't be easy for him in the orphanage. Can't we just leave it as it is? At least for the time being, Nicholas said. The fact is that the mother was not involved in the child's life. The boy didn't even know her. He was brought up by his grandfather. In this respect, nothing will change for Alex. He'll still live with him. I'll look after him. I promise to be here every day. We have a warrant. The older police officer shook her head. We have to take him away. Grandfather can try to get custody, but frankly, I don't think he'll be able to. What if I get custody? The words came out of Nicholas's mouth before he had time to think it through. It was only when he said the phrase that he realized he was really ready for that. He would love to be a father, loving, attentive, caring. I don't mind, the grandfather assured him, hugging his grandson. Alex and Nicholas will be fine. They love each other. I'll sign everything you need. Just don't take him to the orphanage. You? The policewoman was surprised. Can you do that? Sure. We can get temporary custody for you. It won't take long. If you want to take him permanently, you'll have to go through foster parent school, collect a lot of certificates, and you'll also need your spouse's consent. I'm not married. Well, then adoption is out of the question. The baby needs a full family. All right, let's get temporary custody, and we'll figure it out from there. We can do that. But the child needs to live somewhere other than here. It's not the right environment for the boy. I agree. Nicholas, using all his contacts, quickly got temporary custody of Alex. He moved the boy in with him. Alex's mouth dropped open in surprise when he saw the clean, spacious flat. The little boy had never been in such houses. Of course, he liked it here very much. But Nicholas needed a nanny for Alex. The man worked a lot. He could not devote all his time to the child. And then Nicholas thought of Margaret. Margaret was Bridget's friend, kind, sensitive, understanding. It was Margaret who had once helped Nicholas come to his senses, come back to life. They were still in touch. Sometimes they corresponded on social networks, congratulated each other on holidays. Nicholas knew that Margaret had recently divorced her husband, left him with a young daughter, Elizabeth, the same age as Alex. The woman had lost her job because of constant sick leave and was now earning some pennies. Nicholas repeatedly offered her to join him in the department, but Margaret refused. She had a daughter to take care of. The girl was growing up very sickly and did not go to kindergarten. What a job. But now Nicholas was ready to offer Margaret a wonderful option. She would become a nanny for Alex. Nicholas would pay her a good salary, and Margaret would be able to fulfill her professional duties without taking time away from her daughter. Everyone is good. Margaret has money and work, and her daughter is with her, and Alex is looked after. And children of the same age would probably have more fun together. Margaret gladly agreed to the proposal. Now she came to Nicholas's house every morning with her daughter, and he went to work with peace of mind, knowing that Alex was in good hands. It was some incredibly cozy and peaceful time. Nicholas now loved coming home. There he was greeted by a smiling Margaret and cheerful little ones. From the kitchen came the mind-blowing aromas of home-cooked food. On the desk were the children's drawings, clean, cozy, warm. They usually had dinner, all four of them. They talked, laughed, shared the news of the day. Nicholas, of course, did not forget about the old man, Alex's grandfather. Every weekend he and Alex visited him. The grandfather was happy for his grandson and was sincerely grateful to Nicholas. "You're lucky, grandson," he said, ruffling Alex's hair. "I don't know for what merits fate has sent us such a man." But a few months passed, and Nicholas got a call from the guardianship office to remind him that Alex would have to be returned to the orphanage. The temporary guardianship was coming to an end. Just thinking about it made Nicholas's heart grow cold. Alex, a trusting, funny little boy, would end up in a state-run home, unless Nicholas could think of something to adopt him. Nicholas has the conditions. The wealth is more than decent. But the child can only be placed with a full family. That means Nicholas needs to get married, to make a fake marriage. so that on paper everything was as it should be. All that was left was to find a bride. But who to turn to with such a strange request? It had to be someone Nicholas could trust. The answer came naturally. The perfect candidate was at Nicholas's house every day, Margaret. "We need to have a serious talk with you," he began. Nicholas outlined her situation, explained why he needed this stamp in his passport, and actually proposed. Margaret listened to Nicholas attentively, occasionally forgetting to breathe. The man looked at her, certain that she would refuse. Now he would finish, and Margaret would give him all the reasons why she could not go through with it, and she would be right. It was, after all, a very unusual case. "Nicholas, please tell me, do you not remember me at all?" Margaret said suddenly. It was a strange question. Nicholas looked at her in amazement. "How could I not remember you?" "Of course I remember you. Bridget introduced us." "What do you mean?" "No, we've known each other before." Margaret sighed. I knew you. You hardly noticed me. I followed you around at university, looking you in the eye, trying to get to know you. I was dying for love. You changed girls one after another. I thought you were laughing at my feelings. Then I realized you didn't even notice me at all. So it was you. Nicholas couldn't believe what he was hearing. Bridget told me that you'd had this unhappy love affair before. Only then the bloke went to New York, if I'm not mistaken. Well, that's what I told my friends when I realized I wanted to turn over a new leaf. Margaret nodded. They didn't know who this man was. I told them about you, but I never showed them. Wow, Nicholas said. It's so strange and unexpected. And now, many years later, you suddenly proposed to me. Margaret smiled. Not a real one, of course, but still. It's ironic. Did you really love me? How could I have ignored it? I did, she nodded. I've never felt that way about anyone since. It was for the best. They were too strong. Destructive. Even, but then Margaret continued. Then I was able to forget you, to fall out of love with you. I grew up. I realized that you were selfish and fickle, incapable of doing anything responsible or courageous. You're right. It was all me. Nicholas nodded. But not now. That man is gone. In front of me now is a kind, brave man, attentive, mature, and reliable. This man couldn't get past the misfortune of a small child. This man solves problems instead of running away from them. So? He joked. Did you fall in love with me again? He was still reeling from Margaret's sudden confession. Quite possibly, the woman smiled. Why not? Will you marry me then? The deserted shore, covered with soft white sand, the turquoise ocean. Calm waves, the red sun setting rapidly over the horizon. Seagulls soaring in the distance over the water surface, sparkling in the rays of the setting sun. A family is seated on the shore. A tanned man in blue bathing shorts is playing football with two children, a boy with intelligent black eyes and a charming girl. Shouts, laughter, and cheerful chatter. The mother of the family smilingly looks at the merry fiddling of her family from a comfortable sun lounger. In her hands she has a glass with a tropical cocktail, on her head a wide-brimmed hat. The woman looks rested and peaceful. The head of the family has finally had a holiday, so the four of them went to the ocean coast. The woman stood up and slowly approached the beach players, from under the feet of which clouds of sand soared. Nicholas, it's time for dinner for the kids. Well, they should go to bed early, too. There's a field trip tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Remember? Of course, the man smiled. Then he came closer, put his arm around her waist and kissed her tenderly. Did you hear that, children? You must obey your mum. But we want to play some more, objected the little ones. Well, we'll play and make a shipwreck in the bathtub, Nicholas laughed. And then we'll compete to see who falls asleep the fastest. Yay! The children clapped their hands. You're a wonderful father. Margaret smiled. And your husband is the best in the world. How lucky I am to have you. Nicholas hugged his wife again. Then he picked up the children, his daughter on one arm, his son on the other, and the family headed towards the hotel. The father said goodbye to his dying daughter and left the room. and bumping into a fortune teller on the street. MP4. William sat in the grandstand of a large sports hall and watched with admiration his 17-year-old daughter Amanda, who at that moment was demonstrating wonders of flexibility and artistry in an improvised arena made of mats. The girl lightly made a long silk ribbon dutifully curl around her slender legs, and then made a sharp turn, throwing the tip of the ribbon in the air and catching it deftly as her body gracefully rotated around its own axis. The hall immediately erupted in applause, and a happy smile flashed across Amanda's face. After waving goodbye to the audience, the young girl left the mat, and her performance was over. "Dad, what do you think?" Amanda asked her father with excitement in her voice, tightening the laces of her light-colored trainers. "What can I say? You're a professional, sweetheart. A real fairy on stage," William answered her with a smile. "If I hadn't seen you working 10 hours a day in the gym, I'd never have thought that all that fluttering around with ribbons was such a hell of a job." "Oh, come on," shrugged her shoulders. "Standard workouts. I have nothing special. Olympic champions, they work with such dedication that I never dreamt of in my worst nightmares. Can you imagine that they sometimes sleep only 4 hours a night and then go straight to training? I'm just an amateur compared to them." Amanda shook her head, and her father gently stroked his daughter's arm instead of saying anything else. He knew very well how important rhythmic gymnastics was for her, and how much time and effort her daughter devoted to this beautiful but incredibly hard activity. "You are always downplaying your efforts and your talent," William said softly. "You remind me a lot of Mum. She, too, always doubted herself when it came to putting her paintings up for sale in galleries. Always afraid of large-scale exhibitions." Amanda looked at him with a slight sadness. "If you knew how much I miss her, Dad," Amanda said thoughtfully and adjusted the antique silver bracelet on her arm, the only memory of Vivian's mother that she had left after her death. Her father had once given his fiancée this lovely bauble as a token of his intense love, and she had never taken it off since. When her daughter turned 12, William gave her a bracelet. Vivian and the girl, as well as her mother, always wore it on her right hand. "Honey, you did just fine. Mum would be proud of you," her father assured her. "Believe me, after all, it's still just a preliminaries. You have plenty of time to perfect the elements you're not quite sure of." Amanda looked at her father with genuine gratitude and love. "You know, I'm incredibly lucky to have a father. You are the best daddy in the world." The girl hugged her father's neck and lightly kissed him on the cheek. "Are you going to work again now?" "Yes," William said with a sigh. "What can I do if my managers can't make a single deal without me?" Father and daughter looked at each other understandingly, and then laughed. Both of them knew perfectly well that there was nothing to do with managers. It was just that William, being a successful businessman, liked to plan everything himself and make deals on his own terms. That's why he often stayed in his office until late at night or traveled for weeks at a time. The businessman did not trust his business to anyone, not even his most trusted people, and preferred to keep control over everything that happened inside his company. The same humor helped him to diffuse the situation at times when his daughter would have liked to spend a few more hours with her father. Amanda realized, however, that this was unfortunately not possible. "Okay, thank you for coming to the viewing today," she said to William. "It meant a lot to me, really. Daughter, remember one thing, you will always be my priority. No matter what happens, always," William said again. After that, the two of them got into his luxury car and headed to the businessman's country mansion. After dropping Amanda off at home and saying goodbye to her, he went straight to his office. Today, William had an important case scheduled, and he was very much hoping that this time luck would smile on him. The partners from France, with whom the businessman had long dreamed of concluding a contract, had finally paid attention to the success of his firm. Now, William very much expected to conclude a very favorable deal with them. While he and the driver were traveling, the man involuntarily plunged into his own memories. Few people, looking at this still young man of 45 years old, would think that he was born and raised in the most ordinary family. However, this is exactly how it was. William's parents worked at the same factory, his father as a welder in the hot shop, and his mother as a cook in the factory canteen. It was not easy for young William to work his way up through his own social environment. The guy dreamed of big money and serious business almost from childhood, He did not fit in with the ideals of the so-called working youth of those years. Some considered him an upstart, and some directly called him a loser and warned that the desire for more will only come out to his detriment. And William should not get involved with anything more complicated than construction tools or blueprints. However, the young man did not consider it shameful to be a white crow among his peers and went steadily towards his goal, the development of business. At home, William also did not strongly support it, but his father, unlike his mother, who was terribly worried about the future of her not overly ambitious son, at least believed that the boy can still do something. "You shouldn't be so worried about him," Judy said. "Stephen, William's father. He's a bright lad, and he studies all day long." "He'll do well in the big city," said Stephen. "Why should he waste his health in a factory with us for the rest of his life?" Judy only shook her head and cried, "Stephen, darling, look at him. What kind of a businessman is our son? It's ridiculous. He's so frail, so weak, he even got an exemption in physical education. They'll make fun of him there, that's all." William himself was absolutely sure that he planned to succeed, and therefore intensively prepared for entry to the Faculty of Economics all summer after graduation from high school. Hard work and persistence of the guy was eventually rewarded. Having entered the budgetary place at the university, William immediately moved to New York, where he was even allocated a room in the student dormitory. The guy's mother to the last did not believe that her poor boy was leaving to conquer the big city. However, her husband explained to her that such an intelligent and talented guy, such as their son was, simply does not belong in the province. The countryside is dying out. You see, Judy, Stephen tried to reason with her. He has absolutely no future here, unlike in the capital, where he can put all his skills into practice. Judy was still crying, but eventually she accepted it, and sincerely wanted her son to succeed, and he would find his happiness in a noisy and bright metropolis. Over the next 5 years, William pleased his parents and teachers with success in his studies. The guy was considered one of the best students at the university, passing each session only for excellent marks. William's father was very proud, and his mother began to realize that her husband was right. They had already made grandiose plans for the future of their son, when a terrible tragedy occurred in their lives. Both spouses died in a terrible fire that occurred on their property through the fault of drunken neighbors. They had organized a party in their house and did not keep an eye on the stove. At night, the fire broke out with great force and immediately spread to the roof of Stephen's bathhouse, which stood next to the neighbor's house, separated from it only by a flimsy old fence. When William's father woke up and rushed to put out the fire, it was too late. The bathhouse was almost burnt to the ground, and the flames were starting to reach William's own family home. Trying to knock down the fire, the couple used up all the water on the property and wanted to give up. It was useless, especially since the fire department was in no hurry to come to their remote town. The husband and wife tried to take out of the fire all the most valuable things, the money they had accumulated over many years of hard work, and the documents for the house. At that moment, a heavy floor beam collapsed on them with a terrible rumble. The police, who arrived at the scene of the tragedy together with specialists, stated the accident. William's parents died almost instantly, and there was no one to blame for their deaths. William, who was then in his final year of university, learned of his parents' death and went into shock. He could not eat for days, and during the funeral and wake he could not utter a single word. Grief ate away at his broken heart, and the young man wanted and expected nothing more from life. The death of those closest to him seemed to have finally crippled him, destroying all the joy and purpose on which he had lived for the past few years. A week after the incident, William discovered the first gray hair on his temples. At that moment, he finally realized that his youth had come to an end and he had become an adult. On his return to the city, the first thing the young man did was to sell his parents' property. He didn't want to ever return to that town again. Too many difficult events happened there, and William wanted to forever close the door to this part of his past, to settle all matters with the land. The future businessman plunged headfirst back into his studies, trying to ignore the pity in the eyes of his classmates. Now, the main goal of the young man was to finish the university with honors, so he wanted to honor the memory of his mother and father and prove to himself that he could still achieve his goal. Otherwise, all this, both his studies and his move to the capital, was for nothing. The only person who supported him all this time was his girlfriend, Vivian. She studied on the same course as William, but the faculty for herself chose art history. The young student was crazy about painting and architecture and even drew very well herself, but she never believed in her own strength enough to switch from studying art to its direct creation. Vivian admired William's stamina and tenacity. Therefore, when he almost broke the story with the death of his relatives, the girl did everything possible so that her beloved did not feel lonely. It was then that William himself first thought about how strong his feelings for Vivienne. Having realized that only she alone was for him all this terrible time support, William made up his mind and made his beloved a proposal. "Will you marry me?" William asked her in the courtyard of the Philharmonic after they had left the concert early. They both found the concert terribly boring. To make his words sound more solemn, the boy got down on one knee in front of his beloved and handed her a small open heart-shaped box covered with red velvet. Inside, on a snow-white silk pad, lay a gold wedding ring with a tiny but star-like diamond. "My God!" Vivienne gasped in delight. "How lovely." William looked at her expectantly and with some tension in his gaze. Vivienne was silent for a moment, a little confused by the unexpectedness of the situation, but then she exclaimed happily, "Yes, of course I agree, my love." William relaxed, as if a heavy stone had fallen from his shoulders. In a burst of feelings, he spun in a light dance and then gently kissed his bride. After the wedding, life shone with new colors for William. The first thing he had to do was to find a job that would allow them to rent a good flat and continue the cultural lifestyle to which they had become so accustomed during their time as students. So, having collected his documents and diplomas, the guy went to interview in all more or less decent firms, where they were ready to consider his candidature for the place of economist or financial analyst. After the third interview, he was accepted into a promising young firm that supplied building materials all over the country, and it was with this company that the man subsequently worked until he was offered the job. Vivian did not intend to sit at the young husband on the maintenance, and therefore quite quickly found a place as a staff guide in one of the capital's museums. Yes, it was not as prestigious as the work of a real art historian, but certainly better than running on all fumes waitress in some cheap eatery, while your diploma is dusty on the shelf and does not bring any benefit to society. Young people worked hard and then could disappear all day long somewhere in the theater or at fashion exhibitions. For some time the couple lived, as they call it, for themselves, enjoying each other's feelings in society. This is not very much like the parents of Vivienne, who constantly pressed on their daughter with requests to give birth to their grandchildren. However, the girl was resolute in her intention to first get on her feet, and then already engaged in the expansion of their own family. "I don't like your progressive views," daughter Vivian's mother Megan said every time she came to visit her daughter and son-in-law. "My father and I have lived together for years. When are we going to get to know your little ones?" "Mum, you don't have to get along with anyone," Vivian said with a smile. "Not now, not later. William and I are grown-up, independent people, and we can bring up our own children. If we ever need your help, it will definitely be purely one-off," she said. "Don't worry." Vivian's mother, Cynthia, pressed her lips together and looked at her daughter sadly. How she had never thought she would be faced with her own daughter's reluctance to have children in her old age. If they were adults, they would have babysat long ago. And instead of endless culturalizing, how much more? Cynthia, although a native city dweller, was a member of the so-called old school. She didn't understand why her daughter and her husband didn't live like the normal daughters of her friends. Why they don't give birth to fat newborn babies, whose laughter would drown out the vastness of their large one-bedroom flat from morning to night. "You seem to have forgotten what a woman's true mission is, don't you?" Vivian asked her mother, looking at her reproachfully. "Mum, don't start, please," Vivian said, rolling her eyes and begging her. "So I'll remind you. I don't mind," Cynthia went on, as if not noticing her objections. "A woman's mission is to give birth and nurture and pass on all her experience and love to the next generation." Vivian clamped her hands over her ears to keep from hearing the same thing. Vivian's mother had been a high school teacher all her life, and Vivian herself had given birth very late by the standards of her friends, when she was already in her 30s. But when she started talking to her daughter about it, It turned out that she had good reasons, which you see Vivienne herself did not have. "Mama, I promise you, when William and I decide to have a child, you and Papa will be the first to know." Vivienne answered Cynthia tiredly, unable to resist her stubbornness. "How long do I have to wait for you?" The woman said unhappily, and then abruptly turned the conversation to some other subject. Vivienne and William lived childless for several more years before they felt ready to have a son or daughter. And Vivienne was 28 years old at the time. But despite some concerns from doctors about her age, the woman was successful with their future daughter for most of her term. Of course, at first she, as well as all pregnant women, in the first trimester was tormented by a little toxicosis and swelling. But it all passed quite quickly. And then already Vivienne felt just fine. William by then had become a successful top manager in his firm, and the CEO warned him that he sees him as his future successor. Only someone like William would be able to ensure that his company would be able to grow after he retired. William then took the words of his boss with all responsibility and was ready to work 2 or 3 times as much if the company's business required it. At the same time, he was not going to miss the birth of his wife and warned the management about it. The director reacted surprisingly calmly to such an extent he trusted his best employee, so he gave William something like a mini discretionary leave during the birth. Nothing was imminent, and Vivienne was already choosing a name for the baby. Then the news of Megan's death hit her like a thunderclap. That day, William received a call from Vivienne's father telling him that his wife had had a heart attack during the night. William was blown away by the news and for a while didn't know the best way to tell Vivienne about it. He was very worried that such a shock could negatively affect the condition of the child, so at first he even thought not to tell his wife anything before the birth so that she would not worry. However, nothing came out of this idea, because Vivienne quickly realized from his face that something had happened at home. "You're hiding something from me. I can tell," Vivienne said to William as she lay in the labor room, stroking her big, round belly. "You see, by not telling me anything, you're only making it worse." The husband looked at his beloved wife, and in his eyes Vivienne read regret and pain. "What's the matter?" the pregnant woman asked him again, more insistently. "Is it something with my parents? Don't be silent. Tell me." William drew in more air before he said slowly, "Yes, dear Vivienne. You just don't worry. Your mom?" "What? What is it?" Vivienne turned pale, though she realized what was wrong. "She's no longer with us," William said quietly, his head down. For the next few moments, Vivienne sat silent and unmoving. The man was beginning to worry whether she had not gone into shock when her spouse suddenly exclaimed several times and with the words, "Mummy, mummy, darling, why did you go away?" burst into tears in her voice. William tried to soothe her as best he could, but quickly noticed that his wife's sobs had at some point turned into painful cries. Then he called for a nurse, and the nurse, after a quick examination of Vivienne and a touch on her belly, declared that she was in labor. "Oh God, it hurts." Vivienne cried out once again as she was wheeled on a gurney to the labor ward. William was beside her the whole time and said something encouraging to his wife, though now, after all these years, he couldn't remember exactly what it was. He was not allowed into the operating theater. So William was forced to spend the next few hours in the corridor, sitting on a hard, uncomfortable chair and listening to his wife's incessant cries from behind the door. The businessman remembered that at some point his nerves failed him, and he simply passed out. He came to his senses only after the doctor who delivered Vivienne's baby shook him violently by the shoulder. "William, are you all right? Wake up, please," she said. The man struggled to regain consciousness and began rubbing his face with his palms to regain consciousness. When he looked up at the doctor, he immediately realized that something was wrong. Her face was as white as chalk. The hand that had just woken him up was as cold as ice and lifeless. "How's my wife? How's Vivienne? Is she doing well?" was the first thing the businessman asked. The doctor and the nurse quickly glanced between themselves. The doctor then informed William. "I'm very sorry, William. We did everything we could for your spouse, but the bleeding was too much. Plus the baby girl was very large. She hit a vital artery in her mother's body when she was born. Vivienne didn't stand a chance. Again, my condolences." William felt his chin shake with horror then. Salty tears sprang from his eyes of their own accord. "No," he whispered, and shook his head negatively. "No, it couldn't be. She couldn't be dead, she couldn't." "Catherine, take William to the spare room and sedate him," the doctor ordered the nurse. "We don't need him throwing a tantrum in here." The man himself did not remember how he had ended up in the ward, lying on the hard bed and staring at the ceiling at a single point next to the old chandelier. It was only now beginning to dawn on him that he had lost her. Lost his Vivian, the only woman with whom he felt truly alive and happy. They had been married for almost 8 years. 8. He couldn't even believe it at the time. It seemed to him that they hadn't been married more than a week or two. And now she was gone. God, how William roared like a wounded beast. For what? All that was left in his chest. Every vestige of his soul seemed to have been burnt to the ground. The pain of loss was so intense that he felt it physically, right where his tortured heart was located. Only later did he remember that he had a child. "A girl, my daughter. What's wrong with her?" William asked the silence surrounding him. Jumping out of bed, the man rushed to the doctor's office and asked the surgeon who delivered his wife the same question. "Calm down. Please sit down," the doctor pointed him to a chair. When William reluctantly complied, the woman continued. "Your daughter is fine. She's in a postpartum pod right now. This is perfectly normal for her situation." The businessman looked at her as if his future depended on her words. "Given that her mother has died, the baby will have to be fed exclusively by artificial feeding. So I advise you to look into the matter as soon as possible." The doctor looked at William a little harshly, but when she saw that he was genuinely worried about the fate of his child and at the same time worried about the tragic death of his wife, she softened. "Look, I understand what you're going through, honestly. But you're not the first, and, unfortunately, not the last man whose wife dies in childbirth. It happens, and there's nothing we can do about it." The doctor leaned closer to the businessman and continued. "The only thing you need to think about now, what you need to concentrate on as much as possible, is your little girl in the neonatal box. Your little girl is a fighter. She's tough. So be a role model for her. Be strong, confident in your own success. Believe me, children read all this as no worse than adults. Besides, it will help you get closer. What is incredibly important to a child who lost his mother in the first few hours of life." William nodded slowly then and swallowed with difficulty the huge lump in his throat. If all of what the doctor was saying was true, then he would be the best father in the world to his daughter. When he was allowed to pick up his daughter, William almost cried when he saw the tiny baby girl in the pink warm envelope. The same day he gave the girl the name Amanda, which means beloved in Hebrew. For the next 17 years, the businessman did everything possible for his daughter so that she would never stop feeling his love and support. Although at first it was very difficult for a single father, but he still managed to survive this difficult period. Despite the constant busyness, William still tried to be close to his child at the first opportunity. Not a single birthday or New Year's Day Amanda never spent alone or surrounded by only nannies and children from kindergarten. When her daughter at the age of 4 seriously took up rhythmic gymnastics, her father was only amazed at the willpower and stamina of his beloved little girl. The girl's grandfather, Sebastian, in the early years of great help his son-in-law, took his granddaughter to the section, and later into competitions. Amanda adored her grandfather and considered him her second best friend on earth after her father. Unfortunately, Sebastian was already quite old at that time and, like his late wife, had heart problems. When the granddaughter was 9 years old, her grandfather passed away. The cause of the man's death was a massive stroke, which immediately gave a fatal complication to his heart. Amanda cried very long and hard at the time. She could not imagine life without her beloved grandfather. So William was forced to take an unscheduled leave of absence from his firm for an indefinite period of time. For the next 2 weeks, he never left his daughter's side, keeping her entertained and distracted until the grief of the little child gradually subsided. In time, Amanda returned to her daily routine and constant training, and this was the salvation that helped her to finally calm down and become stronger in spirit. "I will dedicate every victory I win to my grandfather," Amanda promised her father. "I believe that he, Mom, and Grandma are all watching over me from heaven and would really like to see me succeed in sport." "Of course, darling," the business smiled affectionately, stroking his daughter's soft light brown hair. "You know, you're an incredibly wise girl. I'm really glad you were able to let go of Grandpa and continue to enjoy life." "I love you, Daddy," Amanda replied shortly and hugged her father tightly around the neck. "William, are you okay? Can you hear me?" The businessman was called out by his driver as they approached the office, bringing the man out of his reverie. "Ha, what?" "Yes, of course, Kevin, you were saying something." William was not immediately able to return to reality. The driver, Kevin, looked at him carefully in the rear-view mirror but said nothing. He had often noticed how his boss was absorbed in his thoughts while driving, so he was used to it. "Yes," I said. "Human Resources just called and said they were able to find you a new receptionist," Kevin said as he carefully parked the car. "They want you to take a look at her. They say she's very competent, knows what she's doing. Even worked for your competitors some time ago, but she left them because she wasn't satisfied with her salary." "That's right," William chuckled. Well, let's see who this lady is. I hope she at least knows how to make good coffee." A quarter of an hour later, he received in his office a tall, long-legged beauty in her 30s, who gave him her graceful, thin hand. The woman introduced herself as Cynthia and told the businessman about her extensive experience in secretarial work. The director of the company noted to himself with satisfaction that the personnel officers had not lied to him. This sultry brunette with plump lips and a slim waist really held her dignity and could present herself as if she were a real professional. And her chic appearance was just the cherry on the cake, quite in keeping with the requirements of such a solid company as they were. "I think we'll work well together," Cynthia Williams said. "Congratulations, you've been hired. Of course, you'll have to go through a probationary period first, but I don't think you'll have any problems with that." Cynthia gave him a charming smile, then elegantly flicked a strand of her dark, bitter coffee-colored hair over her shoulder. "Thank you, William," she said. "I'm sure I'll enjoy working for your company, too. I can feel the positive energy in the place." The woman rose easily from her chair, and at that moment the businessman saw a small, but very racy part of her tanned cleavage. Cynthia smiled again, while William involuntarily threw himself into a fever, and for a few moments he even found it difficult to breathe. Since the death of his beloved spouse Vivian, the businessman had never remarried. Moreover, he had not been able to find a worthy companion with whom he could spend his time carefree and to whom he could open his soul as easily as he had once done with his wife. And he was just as worried about Amanda. How would the girl feel about having another woman in his life? Would she get along with a hypothetical stepmother? Or would the relationship between them be in constant tension? All these fears tormented William and did not give him the opportunity to really relax in the company of a pleasant woman. Later, he gave up these thoughts, referring to his age and constant business busyness. Moll, who would marry him so busy? And there stood before him this stunning Cynthia, whose smile could drive any sensible man crazy with a snap of her fingers. The businessman's heart beat faster. He had only to imagine that he could marry such a beautiful person. However, William hurried to put such thoughts out of his mind. He did not want to become a bad illustration of the famous joke about the boss and his faithful secretary mistress. Gathering all his composure, William politely said goodbye to the young woman, and she sent him a promising smile in return, after which she replied in a quiet voice. "I look forward to my first day of work," she said. "Good day, William." Cynthia said this and slipped through the open door of his office as gracefully as she had entered. The businessman leaned back in his chair with relief and took a few deep breaths. And faced with such a situation, he certainly hadn't expected even from himself such a reaction. Was it the first time in all these years that a real hot feeling flared up in his soul? Is this the autumn of love, which so many famous poets have sung in their verses so many times? Be that as it may, I must look at this Cynthia first, William thought to himself. It's not right at my age to rush headlong into something like this. I should wait a little longer. Having made up his mind, the man returned to work with difficulty and spent the rest of the day completing the final accounts. However, no matter how hard he tried, he could not get out of his mind the beautiful secretary, with whom he was now to work side by side. What an old fool, William scolded himself. God forbid you should fall in love in your old age. What are you going to do with all those feelings? The man shook his head, reproaching himself for his own heartfelt intemperance. He could only calm himself when he had washed his face with cold water for several long minutes. At the same time, Cynthia was leaving the building with a satisfied smile on her face and getting into a taxi, giving the taxi driver the address. The woman leaned against the car window and thought happily to herself. Bingo. You've got me, my good man. Now I'll get everything out of you. It's a sin to miss such a big fish. It's time for me to get my rightful piece of happiness with a millionaire. I'll finish one thing first, and then I'll get right on to you, William. Turn it up, she said to the driver, and he turned the radio knob. The cabin filled with some pop tune in which the singer happily boasted of her wealth and happiness in private jets, diamonds, and rich customers. In fact, Cynthia was not too fond of music, but this song reflected her gambling moods right now in the best possible way. A couple of weeks after that, William's life was sharply divided into before and after. The businessman, as usual, dropped off his daughter Amanda for a workout, himself going to the office. Amanda, being a recent graduate, decided to finally connect her life with rhythmic gymnastics. That's why she wanted to perform at regional competitions first, and then start preparing to enter the Institute of Physical Education. Nothing that day did not foreshadow the terrible misfortune that would soon burst into William's life. Like a terrible storm, he was working in his office as usual, when suddenly his mobile phone rang. Bringing the screen up to his face, the man was surprised to see that it was his daughter calling. Strange, the businessman thought to himself. Amanda never calls during training. Something must have happened. Feeling a slight unease in his soul, William answered the phone. Hello, May. Hello, William, an unfamiliar female voice asked him. Yes, he answered in a trembling voice. Why are you calling from my daughter's phone? Who are you? There was a second pause on the other end of the line, and then the same voice said, My name is Mrs. Helen. I'm your daughter Amanda's coach. Your little girl just fainted right during practice. I don't know what happened to her, but an ambulance is taking her away right now. You better come to the hospital. She dictated the address. William felt the ground slipping away from under his feet, his eyes darkening sharply. He wrote down the address of the hospital, and after drinking a large glass of water and a sedative, he drove there. When he explained at the emergency room who he was and who he had come to see, he was immediately taken to the doctor who had dealt with Amanda's condition since her admission. As he looked at the doctor, businessman William noted with annoyance that the expression on his face was very worried. Explain to me what is wrong with my Amanda, he asked as they entered his office. The doctor hesitated for a moment, a little unsure how to begin. Then he asked with a sigh. Tell me, have you ever noticed any suspicious symptoms in your daughter? Sudden hematomas, weakness, high body temperature for no particular reason? The businessman shook his head confusedly. No, never. I have a daughter who is an athlete. Sure, she gets bruises a lot, but none of the things you just mentioned. Anyway, Amanda has never complained about anything. You see, I work a lot, although I try to be home more often, but it's not always possible. The doctor twiddled his pen thoughtfully before answering. I see. In that case, I have some bad news for you. William tensed, unable to even guess what the doctor was going to tell him. My God, what's wrong with my daughter? He asked quietly. It is suspected that Amanda has acute leukemia. The examination showed that she has a monstrously high level of certain enzymes responsible for blood clotting. Unfortunately, such a disease can manifest itself in a person at almost any age. And teenagers who are actively engaged in physical activities, alas, are also at risk. William lowered his eyes, unable to look at the doctor. It had not yet fully dawned on him that his daughter was in mortal danger. Glancing down at his lap, the businessman noted with surprise how his hands were shaking with a fine tremor. It seemed to him that he was in some terrible nightmare from which there was only one way out to wake up. Tell me, is there anything I can do to help her? The businessman asked the doctor in a slumped voice. His own voice seemed alien to him, as if he was seeing and hearing himself from the outside, as if in a film. The doctor looked at him carefully and answered with a sigh. Yes, but we don't have much time, the doctor continued. We will still do further examinations. So for now, the girl will remain under our care. You can have your blood analyzed. If you have a complete match, then we can perform a bone marrow transplant from you to your daughter. It's the only way to beat the disease completely. A tiny flicker of hope flashed in businessman William's eyes at the doctor's words. Of course, doctor, I'd do anything, even give up my whole self for spare parts, just to make my little girl well. Good, he nodded. Then let's go in. You need to be prepared. William stopped the doctor here, touching his arm lightly. Excuse me, can I see Amanda? I need to talk to my daughter, explain everything to her. She must be so terrified right now. The doctor's voice sounded soft as he answered. Don't worry, she already knows everything. Your girl is a real fighter. She took the news so calmly. The doctor looked at the businessman with slight envy. You know, if I had a daughter like that, I would be incredibly proud of her. Such resilience and will to live. William nodded absently. Yes, I have her like that. You're not the first person to say that to me. A few hours later, when all the necessary tests had been carried out, the doctor left the office, looking glumly at the results. From his face, the businessman realized that the doctor was very unhappy about something. Doctor, how about it? Can I become a donor for Amanda? The doctor slowly tore his gaze away from the papers. His eyes were full of regret and sadness. To my great regret, William, you are not a match. The world at that moment instantly lost all its colors in the eyes of the businessman. William felt his hands trembling sharply, so he slowly sat down on the edge of the chair in the hall. Why? Was all he could ask. It happens often, the doctor answered as calmly as possible. Don't get upset before the time. It just needs a closer relative with similar genetic material. Tell me, does your daughter have brothers and sisters? The doctor asked. Maybe the girl's mother could also try to donate her blood. Depressed millionaire William could hardly answer. Her mother died many years ago in childbirth. I am the only one she has left. Amanda has no brothers and sisters. The doctor shook his lips, taking a seat next to the businessman. Then you have only one option left to urgently find a donor. I will, of course, send a request through my channels, but the chance that they will be able to find one so quickly is very slim. Are you trying to find any other relatives? Amanda, preferably on her mother's side. Even the most distant relatives might happen to have a phenotype that matches ours. William listened to the doctor while his head was in a fog. Finally, turning to the doctor, he looked at him with eyes full of mute pleading. Can I still see Amanda? Please. Of course, let's go, the doctor responded instantly, and led the man to a separate room where his daughter had been transferred at William's request after the first examination and all the necessary care. Daddy, Amanda exclaimed, and her father rushed to her, holding her tightly in his arms. Amanda, honey, how are you? Asked the businessman. Tears were already glistening in his eyes. Amanda looked very pale, but she was doing well. When she spoke, her voice sounded almost cheerful. Normal, considering what happened to me. Dad, how is this possible? Why did this disease choose me? There was no fear in Amanda's eyes, but there was a huge question in them, and a sense of injustice. What about my competitions, my training? The girl tried to talk about the most everyday things, obviously trying to push away the worst thoughts. William smiled through his daughter's tears and stroked her face as gently as if she were made of crystal. I'm afraid we'll have to say goodbye to that for a while, he said slowly. Your health is the most important thing now. After a little silence, the businessman decided to be honest with his daughter. Amanda, William said in a sad voice, unfortunately, I can't be your donor. My blood is not suitable for you, but I will definitely solve this issue. I will find a donor, I promise you. When Amanda learnt that her last hope was gone like smoke, she couldn't hold back her own tears. How much, Dad? She asked. How much? Do the doctors give me? The man sighed heavily before answering. The girl realized that she didn't have long to live. I see, Amanda said slowly. It turns out that this might be our last meeting. The girl looked at her father so piercingly that the businessman's heart squeezed. "No, of course not," William tried to reassure her. "I will definitely come to see you again. I'll just try to find someone whose blood is exactly the right match for you. I'll save you, daughter, I swear." Amanda slowly stroked her father's cheek. "Promise me you won't give up, even if I'm not in your life. You absolutely must live and remember me." "Then I'll be calm up there." The girl raised her eyes to the ceiling, referring to the sky. "Don't say such things to me," William exclaimed in despair. "You will live, do you hear? You will live." He began to cover Amanda's hand with kisses, and then assured her that he would come to visit her in a few days. His daughter also kissed her father on the cheek, after which the businessman handed her over to the care of the doctors and left the hospital as if he had just been run over by a train. A month. Only a month was left for his daughter, because the disease came upon her with terrible force. The doctor said the leukemia outbreak could have been triggered by extreme stress on the eve of the competition. For the first time in his life, William regretted giving his daughter to rhythmic gymnastics. The man sank down on the cold stone steps leading to the medical center and wrapped his arms around his head in despair. What was he going to do now? Where to get that damned donor when Amanda's mother's entire family had been dead for a long time, and he had never heard from any other relative? At that moment, he saw out of the corner of his eye a woman stop in front of him. Or rather, he didn't even see all of her, just her feet, shod in summer open sandals. A long skirt of light material flowed around her legs, and William slowly raised his worry-weary face to her. "Who are you?" he asked, looking up at the street fortune teller smiling at him as she strolled leisurely through the city streets at that hour. "I am Elizabeth," the fortune teller replied solemnly and held out her hand to him. "I see that you need help, my dear. Let me read your hand. Don't worry, your hand. Don't worry, I won't charge you any money. I see when people are genuinely worried about their misfortune, and when they ask for fortune telling for fun." The most interesting thing was that this Elizabeth did not look like some gypsy from a traveling tailor. She was a well-dressed young woman of about 25, with long blonde hair and a high ponytail, and a light blue denim jacket thrown carelessly over her white, aristocratic shoulders. Her blue eyes looked at William with such genuine sympathy and warmth that he couldn't bear to send her away. "I don't think you can help me," the businessman replied tiredly. "I don't think anyone will be able to find the answer to the question that now occupies me more than anything else in the world." The fortune teller's eyebrows rose in amazement. "Do not believe in the power of my gift? Or do you think that because I don't look like a gypsy, I'm of no use to you? I have an Irish gypsy grandmother, by the way. That's why she's white-skinned. We all came from Egyptian coloring." William looked at the girl curiously. "I've never heard of such a thing," he said, and rose slowly to his feet. "Well, Elizabeth, if you are so sure, then please." The man held out his hand to the fortune teller, and she instantly grasped it, scrutinizing the tiny lines on his palm and fingers. All the while, Elizabeth twirled his hand back and forth and nodded affirmatively, as if she had already figured it all out and was looking for the latest confirmation of her amazing discovery. "It's clear," she said at last, and looked at the rich man with sincere sympathy. "Do you have someone in your bloodline who is ill? Very close, a daughter or a sister? I think it's the daughter. You want to help her, but you don't know how. Fate says you need to find someone else. Then you can save her." William, who had been standing all this time listening to the fortune teller with undisguised amazement, suddenly frowned sharply. "What do you mean, find another? What does it all mean?" Elizabeth took another quick glance at his palm and nodded affirmatively. "That's right. There can be no doubt. The prophecy says so." William pulled his palms from her hands, muttering disappointedly. "What is this nonsense? I almost fell for it. Jesus." Elizabeth, realizing that the businessman didn't believe her, only shrugged her shoulders. "It's up to you. I told you the whole truth as it is. This is the salvation of your daughter. If you let it go, don't speak ill of me, because I warned you." With these words, Elizabeth strode away with dignity towards the park, leaving the bewildered and shocked rich man alone with his thoughts. To find another. What can that mean? Meanwhile, the businessman puzzled. Although he did not believe in the predictions of this strange blonde, but in his gut he felt that there was something important in this phrase. something that would help him find a way out of the terrible situation with Amanda. Elizabeth was on her way home when she witnessed a horrifying scene. As she walked across the bridge, the fortune teller saw a young girl of about 17 or 18 years of age flying over the railing. The intentions were more than easily guessed. So Elizabeth rushed towards her and only by a miracle managed to grab her shoulder, pulling her towards her. "Are you out of your mind?" she shouted at the girl when she was already sitting on the pavement, holding her trembling heart. "Have you had enough of life?" "And if so," shouted back the unhappy girl, and large tears came to her eyes. "If I have nothing to live for and nowhere else to live, what am I to do? Collect alms?" Elizabeth, the street fortune teller, knelt down beside the girl. "Look, I understand you've had an accident. Something really bad, I guess. You just decided to jump off a bridge into the river. But only the most horrible and unfair things in the world shouldn't make you do something so stupid, you know? Life is the most important, the most precious thing we have. How can you just try to walk away from it?" The young stranger looked at the fortune teller, and her face showed hopelessness and anguish. Deceived, she tried to explain. "So deceived that I don't know how to go on living or what to do." Elizabeth looked at her doubtfully. "A boyfriend? What a guy." The stranger waved her away. She tried to get to her feet, but she was still a little shaky from the shock. "My aunt. She robbed me of my flat by deceit. She changed the locks. I didn't even have time to get my things before she threw me out of there like a kitten." The girl covered her face with her hands and wept bitterly. Elizabeth felt sorry for this young fool who was ready to give up her life for some miserable square meters. Then the fortune teller suggested to her, "You know what? Let's go to my place now. I'll give you hot tea, and we'll eat something at the same time. And you'll tell me everything in detail, who and how deceived you. Maybe I'll be able to help you in some way." The girl looked at her with red, tear-stained eyes and nodded gratefully. "Thank you. And please forgive me. I didn't mean to scare anyone. It's just my desperation." "Don't worry. I'm not vindictive." The fortune teller smirked and extended her hand to introduce herself. "My name is Elizabeth. What's yours?" Kimberly, the girl, nodded, answering the handshake. "What a beautiful name you have. Is it something European?" "It's Greek," the fortune teller explained. "It's just rare nowadays. My grandmother chose it for me. She hoped that I would make fewer mistakes in my life than my mother." The young woman explained to Kimberly that the name Elizabeth translated from ancient Greek is pure, pure. And the fortune teller's mother had been known for her excessive love of men and promiscuous relationships, for which she'd eventually paid the price. Grandmother said one of her admirers had sent her to the grave, Elizabeth said, as they put the kettle on and poured the flavorful shortbread into a saucer. By then they had arrived at the fortune teller's small flat. "What a horror." Kimberly shook her hands. "How did you survive that?" The woman shrugged and threw her jacket on the old plush sofa. "I don't know. I was only 5. My grandmother brought me up. She'd taken care of me all the time before that, while my mum was getting on with her life. And when all this happened, she took me away from the Tabor and moved here, to the city. We've lived together ever since. She taught me her skills, and I was the best domestic helper for her. It's just a pity she didn't live to see my high school graduation. My grandmother made me such a dress that all my classmates were green with envy the whole evening." "Losing a mum is the greatest tragedy in a person's life," Kimberly said thoughtfully, then added, "I lost mine too. Just recently. Just 4 months ago." "I'm sorry," the fortune teller lowered her eyes. "What happened?" "I'm sorry if I'm prying. You promised you'd tell me what happened to you. Remember?" Kimberly looked sadly at her new friend. "On the accident. Mum was coming home from work and crossing the road at a green light. At that moment, some car just oversteered. The police said it had a brake failure or something. Anyway, Mum had been hit by a car." Elizabeth looked at her sympathetically. "And then her sister turned up, my aunt." The girl went on. "I was just finishing school and I wanted to go to school to study history. It all came upon me so suddenly and terribly. My mum's death, not knowing what to do next." Kimberly sighed heavily before continuing. It was the first time she ever showed up at a funeral. She was all beautiful and caring, helped with the wake. But then when all the guests left, it was like she'd been replaced. Cold, calculating bitch. That's what she turned out to be. Yes, I can see that you have a complicated relationship with that Aunt Elizabeth said, astonished. That's an understatement, Kimberly said, wiping away tears of anger with her fist. All she wanted was Mum's flat. That's all. She complained to me that I was the only one living in a two-bedroom like this, and she was the one who had to live in rented flats. Since she's a sister, she's entitled to a share of Mum's property. I tried to explain to her that there was no mention of her in the will, but this woman was just incredibly stubborn. The fortune teller listened without interrupting, giving the girl a chance to talk. In the end, Kimberly continued, the aunt suggested that we split the flat so that none of us would be offended. I was a little upset, but then I felt sorry for her. She and Mum had a really bad relationship all her life. I don't know what caused it, but it must have been something serious. I don't think they'd fight over something like that. Kimberly took a big sip of tea and finished her sad story. Anyway, I agreed to the exchange, but she brought her lawyer and I couldn't even read what I was signing. It was my fault, of course, Kimberly said through her tears. I should have insisted that they give me time to read the documents. But it turned out there was no exchange, and I'd signed her, that aunt, a deed of gift to my Mum's flat. Here the girl again could not contain her feelings and cried to tears. How stupid I am. The girl scolded herself. How could I believe her? You didn't know she would want to do such a mean thing to you, Elizabeth tried to comfort her. It was always the last thing you expected from the people closest to you. But Kimberly only shook her head in denial. I should have sensed it, should have known that if she was acting so strangely and persistently, she must be up to something. But I fell for it like a stupid chicken. The girl told me that when she came back the next day from the preparatory course for the institute, she couldn't get to her house. She pounded her hands on the door for a long time, until her aunt opened the door and announced to everyone that the flat now belonged to her. And she'd just been cleverly deceived. Can you imagine how I feel? She asked the fortune teller. She told me that she had changed the locks, and now there was nothing in the house that belonged to me. And when I asked her where I should go now, do you know what she told me? Elizabeth looked at the girl curiously. She said that I could try to get into the institute from the first time and immediately to the full-time department, on a budget. Then, she said I would have a room in the dormitory and a place to live. The young fortune teller was amazed at the cynicism of this horrible woman. Well, don't worry, we'll think of something, she patted the girl on the shoulder. Until then, you can stay with me as long as you want. You're a good girl, Kimberly said gratefully. I can see you're not lying about my aunt and my situation. Any of us could be in that situation. If you only knew what I see when I read people's hands or cards, Elizabeth said meaningfully and shook her head. A tiny flicker of hope appeared in Kimberly's eyes at that moment. Thank you so much, she said fervently. I'll definitely find a job. You'll see. I'll help you cleaning, cooking. In response, Elizabeth advised her not to worry and promised her that she would find a way to teach her aunt a lesson and get Kimberly her rightful flat back. For the next couple of weeks, Kimberly lived in Elizabeth's tiny flat and helped her around the house. While the young fortune teller made a living for herself and her by entertaining passersby in the park at the weekend fair, as well as doing personal card readings and making personalized astrological forecasts and horoscopes, which Elizabeth assured her were always the most lucrative. Kimberly also wasted no time and went on all sorts of job interviews. Still, after the shocking story with her aunt and the flat, she could not properly prepare for the entrance exams. So she decided to try to find at least some work, so as not to hang on Elizabeth's neck, and at the same time to get the experience she needed, without which she did not want to take in the little decent companies. At the same time, William was trying to hold on with his life. He was constantly looking for a suitable donor for his daughter, but so far all was to no avail. As before, the businessman visited Amanda in the hospital, but each time he became more and more convinced that she had very little time left. Despite the coordinated, competent actions of doctors, as well as the necessary drugs in such a situation, the girl still needed an urgent operation. Everyone, including Amanda, understood this perfectly well and did not give up hope of finding her donor at last. Remembering the fortune teller's strange prediction, William could not figure out its basic meaning. However, William still listened to Elizabeth's words about bloodlines and hired the best detectives in the city to try to find any of his late wife's distant relatives. "You need to calm down," William Cynthia said affectionately, bringing the man a cup of coffee with dark bitter chocolate on a platter, the businessman's favorite treat for relieving the worst of his stress. "I am sure that sooner or later you will achieve your goal, and Amanda will definitely recover." Every time the secretary looked at her boss with such a languid look that he had to look away. And he, of course, still liked this gorgeous woman very much. And she didn't seem to mind trying to take their relationship to the next level. Except that William wasn't really interested in that right now. His first priority, as he'd always said, was his daughter. Seeing that she was failing to attract the wealthy man, Cynthia bit her lip, while giving the friendliest smile she could muster in front of everyone. "Damn that Amanda of his," the woman said angrily to herself. She had to be sick right now when things were just starting to work out between him and me. She could have waited a year until her father and I were married. She could have switched donors for all I care. No one's stopping me. I'd get his entire fortune. And I'd find a way to make good use of his money. Cynthia hatched similarly devious plans. She continued to work in William's company, while trying to conquer this impregnable fortress. On a future day, as William was scrutinizing the terms of an upcoming deal, his phone suddenly began to ring with a melodious trill. When the man picked up the receiver, it turned out to be one of the detectives he had sent to search for Vivian's relatives. "Well, is there any news?" the businessman asked hopefully. Yes and no, the detective answered him evasively. You see, it turned out that Vivian had no relatives. William's heart immediately dropped down into the darkest abyss. "Are you sure? Maybe you didn't look hard enough. After all, her family was once considered quite famous. No siblings?" And there was a deep sigh at the other end of the phone. "Believe me, William, we have checked all the archives of the town and village where your wife was born, and there's absolutely nothing. However, as I said, we still managed to find something interesting." The businessman immediately concentrated as much as possible on the detective's voice. "What is it? Tell me. You intrigue me." "When we checked the archives of the hospital where your wife gave birth, we found one interesting detail," the detective began cautiously. "Tell me, William, were you aware that Vivian had given birth to twins?" "What? I can't believe my ears," exclaimed the businessman. "Do you realize what you're saying? What twins? My wife never mentioned to me or being pregnant a second time." A hunch slowly began to dawn on the rich man, and it was confirmed by the detective himself. "That's why I'm asking, because it's the same single birth," he said slowly. "One of the 2 medical reports I found says that your wife gave birth to twin girls." William rubbed his forehead tensely. He had no idea what was going on. "But the doctor never told us anything like that." "I don't see how that's possible. Did you have an ultrasound scan?" the detective asked. "Yes, but can you imagine what it was like at that time? The only machine in the whole city, and that one malfunctioned every once in a while. Unless there was some mistake and the doctor who performed the ultrasound just didn't see the second child. But that still doesn't change the fact that I never knew anything about a second daughter." "Where is she then?" William asked. The detective was silent for a moment, obviously considering how best to say the next piece of news. "That's where we come to the interesting part. There was another woman in labor at the same time as your wife that day, the daughter of the same midwife who delivered Vivian's baby. And according to the documents, the midwife's granddaughter died, suffocated, entangled in the umbilical cord." "Jesus," William said. "But what has that got to do with me?" "I'm afraid it has everything to do with me," William continued, the detective. "As I was saying, the main oddity was that there were originally 2 of each medical report. That is, both your wife's and the midwife's daughters. And while in Vivian's case, one of them says that one of her twins died at birth, the midwife's daughter's file says the exact opposite. They gave her my little girl," William finally realized. "I'm afraid so," the detective replied sadly. We found both reports in the chief doctor's safe. Don't ask us how we did it. We won't tell you anyway, the detective returned the professional humor. The fact is, the midwife's daughter never found out. She thought she had given birth to her baby. Soon afterwards, they all went to live together, the woman, the daughter, and their grandmother somewhere up north. And that's where their trail is completely lost. So you don't know where my daughter is now? William asked quietly. Unfortunately, that's all we've been able to find out, the detective replied. But still, you know now that there is another William somewhere. If you are lucky enough to find her. How am I going to find her? William exclaimed in despair. I was counting on you, he snapped at the detective. I don't have any more time. Amanda has no more time, she's dying. It took the businessman a second to pull himself together and apologize to the detective, thanking him for his work. William hung up the phone and slowly lowered himself into his desk chair. Okay, so he had been duped in the most brazen way possible by giving away only one infant of the twins. Vivian's medical records had been completely fabricated. And it seems that even the midwife herself didn't know that Vivian was having twins. When it all happened and his wife was gone, the midwife thought it would be all right if she gave her daughter one of the twins, so that the young woman, God forbid, wouldn't go mad with grief when she learned of her own baby girl's death. William felt absolutely devastated and broken, and his last hope had died before it could take shape. Now the businessman knew only one thing: if he lost Amanda, he would lose all incentive for further life and work. His daughter was everything to him, and he certainly didn't want to live in a world where she was gone. 3 days later, Elizabeth brought Kimberly a newspaper with free classifieds. I grabbed this on the way, in case you find something suitable, the fortune teller suggested, seeing how desperately the girl was suffering without a job. Everywhere Kimberly went, she was offered to take some paid courses or was turned back, referring to the lack of experience of the yesterday's schoolgirl. Kimberly became frustrated and wanted to try to take out a loan from the bank to get some training so that she could get a job. When Elizabeth was able to convince her that all the loans and courses were nothing more than an elaborate ruse paid for by enthusiasts like Kimberly herself. You should read the paper, she urged the girl who had become her best friend. There are always jobs for ordinary people in the paper, and you might find something to your liking. The girl followed the fortune teller's advice and carefully studied the thin magazine. After an agonizing choice between a dishwasher and a cleaner, Kimberly chose the latter. And rightly so, Elizabeth encouraged her. Of course, it's not the most prestigious profession, Kimberly agreed, but it's a very good, well-known firm, and they promise a good salary, not unlike other places. It's a good reason to try for an interview. Kimberly said yes with a sigh. No, it wasn't a career she'd ever dreamed of, but on the other hand, she had to start somewhere. When she arrived at the given address, she found a large, bright office of the construction company, clean and beautiful inside. However, when she went up to the 5th floor to go to the director of the company, Kimberly froze like a stumbling block, unable to utter a single word. The girl turned as pale as a sheet. Her only wish at that moment was to fall through the ground, but it was too late. Cynthia had seen her and now stood blocking Kimberly's path to the principal's office with her arms locked at her sides. "What are you doing here, bitch?" hissed the secretary. Kimberly stared at her, her eyes fixed on her with an angry but proud gaze. "I'm here to apply for a job." "Let me through," she said, and tried to get past Cynthia. But she grabbed the girl roughly by the shoulders. "Are you applying for a job as a cleaner?" Oh my God. And here I was, wondering what brought you here. The secretary's look at that moment reminded me of a snake preparing for a fatal leap. "No, my dear, not today." Cynthia pushed Kimberly to the other end of the corridor. "I don't want you here. I don't want it to turn out by accident that you're related to me. It'd be a shame that would never be cleaned up." Cynthia looked at the young girl with all the anger and hatred she had in her soul at that moment. When William heard the strange shouting and fussing outside the door, he decided to go out and see for himself what was going on. "Cynthia, what's going on? Did the girl show up for her interview or not? Human Resources is calling, saying they've lost her." Cynthia wanted to explain something to him, but saw the supervisor's face change as he looked at her niece. "William, what's wrong with you?" the secretary asked cautiously, and the ugly smile instantly flew off her face. The tests were good, the businessman said. The girl looked at him with uncomprehending eyes. She looked from William to Cynthia and back again. Cynthia turned to her niece, and Kimberly could have sworn she saw a hellfire of rage in her eyes. "Get out of here. Now," Cynthia ordered her. William, however, extended his hand towards the girl and shook his head. "No, let her stay. Please, girl. I don't know your name. Give me a few minutes, I beg of you." Kimberly didn't know what to do, but there was such desperation written on the man's face that the yesterday's schoolgirl agreed. "All right," she said simply, and followed William. He was in a state of complete shock. The exact copy of his daughter was standing in front of him. Could it be true? Was this girl really his lost twin daughter, Amanda? If so, he was left with one last chance to save his child. "Please, let's do a DNA test," William pleaded with her in her office. "My daughter is about to die. The doctors have already done everything they can. If it turns out that you and my girl are sisters, it could literally save a life." Kimberly doubted that could really happen. But the story the businessman had told her about himself and his daughter, and about the results of the investigation, still convinced the girl to try to trust him. After all, if it really is true and Amanda is her sister, then she will have another family. Having consented to the tests and analyses, Kimberly and William went straight to the hospital. When the girl's blood was drawn to run all the necessary tests, the man took her to his daughter's room. Amanda, of course, was as shocked as her father. However, Kimberly was very positive about Kimberly's appearance. She greeted the girl in a friendly manner and then told her, "There is no such coincidence in nature. You can see that you and I look exactly alike. You must be my lost sister," Amanda said. "Daddy told me everything." Kimberly felt like she was in a fantasy film. There was no doubt in her mind that she and Amanda were alike, but she'd never felt like she had a sister, or even a twin. And twins are supposed to be able to sense these things even from a distance. "Congratulations. The test confirmed your relationship 100%. William smiled happily as the doctor announced to the girls, "If Kimberly is ready, we can start the preparation process for the operation." It was all so sudden and rapid for the young girl. "Of course, let's get started," was all she could manage to nod. The preparations went well, and soon Amanda received a bone marrow transplant and a blood transfusion from her own sister. After that, the girl recovered almost immediately, and Kimberly, who was lying in the ward with her, still couldn't believe that she had found both a sister and a father at the same time. In the hustle and bustle of events, Kimberly didn't immediately remember that she wanted to talk to William. When she felt better, she asked to spend a few minutes with her father and warned him about Cynthia. "Don't believe that woman, please," she said in a voice weak from the operation. "She is not as nice and kind as she wants to appear." In general terms, the girl told her newfound father about the story of her flat and the fact that she was now living with the fortune teller Elizabeth. Hearing about the latter, William immediately remembered her prophecy. Find another god, that's what it meant. She was talking about Amanda's sister. He hadn't realized it at the time. When he found out about his secretary's deception, the businessman was furious at her behavior. The very next day, he fired the bastard and threatened her with jail if she didn't sign the flat back over to Kimberly. Cynthia wanted to be rich, and even more wanted to stay free, so she gave the flat back to her niece and left town for good. Kimberly had finally recovered. She was happy to know that she could go home now. She was going to go to college, as she wanted to, and promised her father to visit her and Amanda as soon as possible. The girls had no doubt that they would become friends, so in this plan, businessman William was calm and very happy for them. William had already invited Elizabeth to his workplace as a thank you for helping his lost daughter. He made the woman his personal astrologer. The young woman was very happy that her prophecies came true, saving the life of an entire family. Gradually, the first timid feelings were born between her and William. Their relationship from a working relationship smoothly turned into a romantic one. The man, having talked to Elizabeth closer, realized that she could become for him a new breath of life and create for him that missing home comfort, which he so dreamed of. Soon he and Elizabeth were married. The wedding was very beautiful and left the guests with many fond memories. Now they all live together in the millionaire's house and enjoy every day, which gives them the opportunity to enjoy life again and get to know each other from new sides.